My journey as a Superman fan started with a tattered red cape blowing in the wind. That ending rocketed me forward like a red-blue blur through a decade-long origin story and poignant tales of self-discovery and fatherhood, and backwards to the character's very beginnings. Now, on this podcast, we journey together across time and media to examine the stories that have defined the Man of Steel for over 80 years. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. This is the Donnerverse Part 3. Joining me to discuss the Donner cut of Superman 2 is the host of the Always Hold On to Smallville podcast, Zach Moore. Welcome back.
Haven't you ever heard of freedom of the press, Anthony?
Listen, you want to step outside?
I would much rather step outside, but we'll get into it. So happy to be back on the show.
So we are here, of course, to talk about the Donner cut of Superman 2. It will inevitably lead us to a discussion, I'm sure, of the theatrical cut and the ways in which they differ. Though, just as a reminder for the audience, last year in 2021, Ken Marion and I, we did do a whole episode, a 2-hour extravaganza, where we did unpack the differences between the theatrical and Donner cuts of the film. So that won't be the main thrust of this episode, but if you are looking for more of that discussion, that episode is out there. But, of course, like I said, I'm sure we will touch on the theatrical cut in this episode as well. And additionally, I'm very happy to have you for this one in particular, because I think Superman 2 and the Donner cut of Superman 2, it lends itself very well to a discussion of the ways in which the Donnerverse influenced Smallville, which, of course, is very dear to both you and I.
Yeah. There's a lot of Smallville you can see in this movie. Like season 5 of Smallville is like Superman 2, the season in a way, and a lot more than that. And I will say I did listen to y'all's discussion on the Donner cut versus the Lester cut, and I'm glad I'm here to talk to you about it, because I have you guys were saying so many things, and I was like, it's so interesting because I agree with you guys about so much, but outside of this, but you're saying things and I 100% disagree with what you're saying about certain things here. And you're so matter of fact, like, oh yeah, this is so much better. I'm like, I don't know, but we're going to have fun. It's going to be a fun conversation. So
it's so funny you bring that up. I was going to say something similar, because that episode in particular, one of my longest standing audience members, shout out to Tom O'Sullivan. He's been listening to my comic shop history podcast and this one, and we go back a long way. He was a customer at the comic shop where I worked. And I remember he wrote to me after that episode, and he was so nice about it, but he was like, I had to stop listening halfway through. He was very diplomatic about it, though. He was just like, my opinions didn't line up with yours, and I just had to stop. I mean, I think we were... I don't think certainly wasn't mean-spirited towards the movie, but we beat up on it. We beat up on it a bit. And I guess we did. I mean, it's been a while now since we recorded, but I guess we did land, or I landed on the side of preferring the Donner cut. Mm-hmm. Look, I'm saying it as if I'm asking you. It's been that long, and I'm like, I like the Donner cut better.
You were both very pro Donner cut.
Okay.
It was like, oh, clearly this is so much better in this version and this or that. I'm like, wow. Okay. Interesting. But we'll discuss. That's what this is all about. And we're not going to, you're not going to rehash what you guys said there or have a straight comparison, because you guys have done that. But inevitably, when we talk about the Donner cut, you got to talk about the Lester cut and the change, much like Justice League, right? This is where we are with these movies. You cannot talk about one version without the other. But this is the Donnerverse special, so we're going to predominantly focus on the Donner of it all. And of course, being the huge Smallville fans we are, we'll talk some Smallville along the way. So
yes, but no, I am excited to get your opinion, and I am curious to hear about the ways in which you disagree. It's always fascinating to get those different perspectives. So it's all good. And I will say, it hasn't been that long since I watched the Lester and Donner cuts for that episode last year, but I would say that my perspective has changed a fair bit on Superman 2, specifically the Donner cut, and I view it far more favorably now. So my perspective has shifted a good bit from that episode I did with Ken last year. So for anyone who might have felt like, oh, how can you not love Superman 2 the way I do? I still might not love it the way others out there do, but I have a much more profound appreciation for it than I did before, which is always a positive thing. Anytime I can come away enjoying any of this stuff more than I did before. Always a positive.
Are you saying that our opinions are allowed to change about our fandoms, Anthony? You're saying that our points of view could evolve over time and we could have different opinions?
It is possible. It is possible. It can happen. And it's a beautiful thing when it does, especially when it goes in this direction. Now, I'm assuming most Superman fans are likely aware of the backstory of all of this, but a real quick recap. In the late 70s, Donner was filming Superman 1 and Superman 2 simultaneously, but due to time and budget, the decision was made to focus on finishing Superman 1 and then return to Superman 2 after Superman 1 had premiered. But in the interim, the producers, the Salkins, with whom Donner had an increasingly tension-filled dynamic, decided to replace him with Richard Lester. So Richard Lester came on and filmed the rest of the movie and also reshot a lot of what Donner had already filmed. The overall beats and structure of the movie largely remained intact, but a lot of things played out differently, and Lester certainly injected a more humorous, campier tone that diverged from the feel of the movie that Donner was going for. And perhaps most notably, due to legal issues with Marlon Brando, all of the Jor-El footage was replaced and reshot, and instead we had Clark interacting with Lara in the fortress in the theatrical cut of the movie. So flash forward to the 2000s and the period of time around when Superman Returns was coming out. They worked out what they needed to, and Warner Brothers released the Donner cut of Superman 2 as originally conceived and envisioned. And so that came out on DVD in 2006, and it was edited by Michael Thau in collaboration with Richard Donner. And they restored as much as they could. They had to use some Richard Lester footage. They had to use some screen test footage. They had to film for the Donner cut a few, insert shots and things like that. So it's a little bit of a mix and a little rough around the edges, but you get the sense of what was intended. And I think most importantly, for me at least, you do get the restoration of those Kal-El, Jor-El fortress scenes, which for me make the whole thing. So that's our backdrop for this. Did I miss anything?
No, that covers it. The interesting thing to me was, and I know that you were mentioning in your Superman the movie episode that you'd rewatched the special features. Did you do the same for Superman 2 here, the Richard Donner cut?
I did not, but I had watched the Restoring the Vision featurette that's on the Donner cut DVD and Blu-ray. I had watched that not long ago. I did not rewatch it for this, but I have seen it fairly recently.
That's right. I didn't rewatch it either. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there. But
quite all right.
What was interesting to me though, right, about I remember this from watching. It was years ago that I've seen it, but it stuck with me. The special features, right? That originally they had started this kind of without Donner.
Yes.
And then they brought him in later, and this will be a theme for my conversation here probably. But I feel like, and it's counterintuitive because it's called the Donner cut, but I feel like Donner's involvement was to the detriment of the final product because of his. But I understand because of his personal experience. It was, he basically got fired, right, from this extremely successful first film that everybody loved him. He loved everybody. He was so invested in it, right? Clashed with his higher ups, right? People we can all relate to these sorts of things, right? Had a bad personal negative experience, right? And then when he came back to revisit, he's like, I don't want to use any of this or any of that, and right? And so to the film's detriment, to the Richard Donner cut's detriment as a film, they leave out a lot of stuff that they could have used from Lester, or even alternate takes, or even things Lester did better. They were like, well, I did this first, so we're going to use mine. And I feel like, and I love Superman 2, just for the record, I love Superman 2, and I've gone on a personal journey myself with Superman 2. When I was a kid, it was my favorite. And then you get older, like, oh, well, Superman the movie is clearly the superior picture, right? And then you learn about all the behind the scenes drama. You're like, what a mess, right? And then Donner cut comes out, and you're like, oh wow, that's incredible new stuff, right? There was such a hype for the Donner cut too, because like San Diego Comic-Con, I think the previous year before it came out, or maybe the year it came out, that they had shown the opening sequence of the Daily Planet with Lois and Clark, and scenes we had never seen before, with Margot Kidder as Lois Lane and Christopher Reeve as Clark Kent. It's phenomenal. It's like the Star Wars special edition where, like, you're telling me there's footage of Harrison Ford as Han Solo talking to Jabba the Hutt. It blows your mind as a fan, right? That you've never seen. So the hype was so strong, and then like you see it, like, oh look, Marlon Brando's here. This is fantastic, because all these mythical Marlon Brando scenes you heard about. And then over time, you kind of say like, well, I don't know, like that's kind of like spliced together and this or that. They could have done this differently. This didn't quite hit as well. That was kind of weird. And so I went through that journey. I'm like, I don't know which one's better. But now it's like, you know what? I've learned to stop worrying and love Superman 2. That's where I am. We have different versions. I enjoy them both. And we'll talk. That's what we're here to talk about. But and we really have Superman Returns to thank for this, really, because Bryan Singer wanted to use Marlon Brando footage as Jor-El in Superman Returns, which is a really cool idea, to use a deceased actor as a deceased character. Like that's meta on all kinds of levels, right? So through those negotiations, right, to use that footage, that kind of opened the door to like, well, we have all this footage, so you can use that. And as I understand it, that kind of opened the door for this Richard Donner cut. Plus tying into Superman Returns, which was a vague sequel, which I'm looking forward to your episode on Superman Returns coming up next to discuss that. But that kind of like, well, we can market this as connected to that, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all tied together in the Donnerverse here, and that's kind of where we are. And were you ever familiar with the website Superman Cinema back in the day?
I can't say that I am.
Yeah, that is how I kind of learned about all this stuff. It was called Superman Cinema, and I was actually on the message boards there, and it was kind of my like Superman fandom, like awakening to all these things, right? And it was in high school. I was on these, and I've actually made some friends there that I still talk to this day online and in person. And they had all these threads, all these things about it, and that's how I learned about the Richard Donner cut. And I think that they were kind of absorbed by Cape Wonder, who Jim Bowers runs that, and it's all this, the Richard Donner, Christopher Reeve fan of Superman is very strong on that, and that's how I learned about this stuff. And man, it was crazy to think, and this is like not the infancy of the internet, but it was before social media per se, and again, I'm talking about message boards and stuff, right? But it felt like just such this like I'm like, how could I've watched this movie my whole life. How could there be an alternate version out there that I never heard of? And it was just such a crazy revelation to me. So I guess that was kind of my lead up of knowledge and anticipation for this coming out. So.
Yeah, no, it's funny because as you're saying all of that, I'm trying to think back to how much I even was aware of this and how large, if at all, it loomed in my own Superman fandom, the idea of this other cut. I mean, to be honest, I really don't recall all that specifically. So I guess it wasn't that big of a thing. Like I definitely remember when it was announced, and I remember when it came out, and I ran out to Best Buy and I bought the Donner Cut DVD as soon as it came out and all that. But, this wasn't something that I guess I was thinking about so much in anticipation of it. Not like I would later do with a different director's cut of a movie.
With another Superman sequel where director was replaced.
Yeah, quite the commonality there. But your point is definitely well taken about some of the ways, at least in which the Donner cut suffers by trying to stick as closely as possible to the original vision. I mean, you mentioned, look, right in the introduction, you mentioned the famous line when Superman shows up at the Daily Planet to call out General Zod. And in the theatrical cut, we get the line, "Would you care to step outside?" And it's a perfect callback to the fight at the diner that the powerless Clark has just gone through.
It ties into Donner footage.
That's the thing. And so that's replaced with, "Haven't you ever heard of freedom of the press?" And it absolutely does not land the same way. And that's one of those things where, look, going back to Zack Snyder's Justice League, he has said in interviews, he was like, "I would rather burn the movie than use one frame I didn't shoot myself." And it's like, all right, man, like, I understand that. And I don't know if Donner had a similar mentality. Obviously, he had to use some Lester footage. There was stuff, the Battle of Metropolis, that he just didn't get to film. But, that's one of those instances where, and we can't speak for him, but it's like, do you think he genuinely, objectively felt like freedom of the press was a better line? Maybe he did, but I'm hard pressed to see that.
I don't think so. And also, and this is we love Superman too, right? But we're getting into the weeds here, right? There's some voiceover work in here, which is clearly voice doubles, and I'm pretty sure whoever says General is not Christopher Reeve. Like, it just sounds, because I rewatching it, I was like, that it sounds like when he says freedom of the press, it sounds like him, but like the voiceover guy doesn't. Just like the guy who says, "Lois, what have you done?" and all these strange. I'm like, you could have used clearly this movie, this version of Superman 2 has no problem taking elements, visuals, music, right? Footage from Superman the movie. Why not just take something with like Clark saying, "Whoa, us," or just use the general from not, we're getting so granular here, but like this, it's just like use the general from Superman, the theatrical one there, instead of some weird voiceover guy. So it's just the whole thing throws, the music doesn't build up the same. Anyway, that kind of stuff is what we're talking about. But no, I think it's absolutely what it is. I think it's Richard Donner saying, you know what, I'm going to take back my movie that got taken from me. And you know what, like to your point, it's your thing, man. Like your name's on it. So I can't sit here and say, it's how armchair quarterback of me to be like, Richard Donner, director of Lethal Weapon and Superman the movie and the Woman, let me tell you what you should have done. But it's clearly still was a very personal thing to him. Like this is gosh, what, 25 years after it had come out, and you could still tell he doesn't like the soft cuts, and I guess calling back to what I even first started with, talking about the special features, Michael Thal, the editor, this is what stuck out to him. He explains, he's like, yeah, so I had this initial cut of the movie, right? And it had, the memory kiss, and then he returns the flag to the White House, and he beats up the guy at the diner. It's a great ending. And that was my initial cut. And then I brought in Richard Donner and Tom Mankiewicz. So they go, no, we can't do that. And I was like, oh, well, that what? And this has always stuck out to me. Tom Mankiewicz, a fantastic writer, creative consultant on both Donner films, Superman films, and they had asked him to come back, and he had, turned them down because his loyalty and his friendship with Richard Donner, totally understandable, right? And he is kind of what brought a lot of like groundedness and stuff to Superman the movie. But he always said something that I always stuck with me. He's like, well, Clark Kent can't kiss Lois Lane. This scene won't work. And I was like, what? what are you guys talking about? No, that's not how this works. So I just, they had certain things that they were like, no, we have to do this, we have to do that, which led to certain other things, which made this less than the sum of it could have been. That's ultimately where I fall on it. And then then there's a lot of deleted scenes that Donner shot that aren't in the Donner cut, and I don't understand. Like that to me, I don't like all the other stuff. Even though I creatively disagree, I understand like the emotion behind it. But I'm like, Donner, you had like the villains go into the fortress, more of Lex and Miss Tessmacher. Like you had other things that you shot, which are in TV versions of this, by the way. That's the ultimate cut, by the way, out there somewhere. I'm waiting for that 3-hour TV cut to come out like the Superman the movie one did. Hopefully someone will find that on the shelf. But that, to me, that's an odd choice to not use your own footage in your own cut of the movie, right?
I know. I rewatched those deleted scenes last night as well as I was rewatching the movie, and I had the same thought. I was like, wow, it's odd to have omitted these. To be perfectly honest, Lex and Miss Tessmacher coming and going from the fortress, it's like, all right, I can take or leave that. But Lex and the villains being carted off by the Arctic police, that felt like a key moment that would have been very natural to include here. And like you said, the villains showing up at the fortress and and some of those other pieces. Yeah, that was somewhat curious. I mean, I guess in the end, and you hit on this, that the mandate for this Donner cut wasn't to create the ultimate cut, as it were, of Superman 2, using the best of both versions. It was really to recreate to the extent possible what the original intention was. I can get on board with most of that, where the one thing that I just still cannot get over, no matter how much my opinion of this movie has changed or improved, the one thing I can never get past is the reversal of time at the end.
100% with you there.
And it's one of those things where, again, man, I so appreciate that they're like, look, we're showing you when we initially set out to make this movie at the very beginning, this is what we were going to do. But my feeling is, okay, you clearly knew you needed a new ending, right? Because you used this ending for Superman 1, where Lois dies, he reverses time. You knew you couldn't. So my feeling is like, I would have preferred if they tried to recreate what they would have done had they gone back to work on the movie after Superman the movie came out. What ending would you have used then? And I guess they hadn't figured that out, but maybe that would have been something to figure out. Or just end the movie after Superman leaves Lois on her balcony. It's a bittersweet, melancholy end, but it's lovely in its own way, and it works, and it doesn't create the reversal of time completely undermines and renders moot everything that we've seen before. That's so frustrating.
I have so many thoughts. So I'm a great defender of the reversal of time in Superman the movie. I feel like it's like, the power of love, right? I mean, like the idea of pushing himself. It's him here for a reason. Don't interfere with human history. Him hearing his two fathers in the sky. He makes his decision. He's like, I'm not going to let this happen again, right? It's a powerful moment carried by Christopher Reeve's emotional performance, right? His despair, his rage, like that primal scream is incredible, right? Such an amazing shot of him as well. And it's just, he goes back in time like 5 minutes, right? And it's like, and it's a one-off thing, and it's not going to happen again. And you understand, and it's not. I've talked about this with friends at the lunch table in high school for years. It's like, he's not literally reversing Earth. It's a visual representation of him traveling into. It's a 1978 special effect visual representation of a superhero going back in time. Okay, it's not reversing the rotation of the Earth. It's a fun joke. We all laugh about it, but that's he's going back in time. He's going forward in time. And that works in a one-off, right? And I know a lot of people have a huge problem with that, right, in the movie. And I'm like, you know what? Fair enough to you, but this is the pre-crisis Superman who is just incredibly powerful, right? But you can absolutely never do that again. And I can't believe they did it. I cannot believe they did. They made a sequel to a movie that was never made with this. Like, this Richard Donner cut is a sequel to, like, well, if we didn't do because the initial idea for Superman the movie was it's going to end on this cliffhanger where he throws the missile into space, and free with Zod was the cliffhanger. But then when they decided to kind of like, well, we don't know what we're going to do because we're over budget, like, they made Superman the movie self-contained. And this had to be a sequel to that, not what you would have done in 1977. You needed what you would have done in 1980. And to your point, it doesn't lead anywhere. Like, there's not a Richard Donner Superman 3. So just make this its own little offshoot universe, and Lois can know, and they can leave it there, melancholy. And I thought to myself, like, okay, the time reversal. Why did you do this? And I thought, well, maybe they just want to use every last piece of footage, right? They want to use the toothpaste going back in the tube, right? There was, what a fun gag, right? Or even the last scene with Lois and Clark at the planet. That's a great scene. I think you could have still find a way to edit around it, to use it to still work. But I'm like, you know what? It's okay. They wanted to use every last shot the Donner shot. I get it. And then, to my earlier point a couple of minutes ago, you have multiple scenes that you shot you didn't put in the movie. So it's frustrating. It's just very frustrating experience because to me, honestly, that's what breaks it. The time reversal breaks the movie for me, which cements the theatrical being the better version, in my opinion.
Here's the thing. There's so much that I love about the Donner cut, and I feel that in terms of a number of plot points, but more specifically some major thematic beats, it really closes a loop with Superman the movie and ties in very nicely. So there's a lot that I love about it. But no, I can't sit here and make a case that if you could only watch one version of the movie, that it would be this. There are parts of this, really the Jor-El scenes, make this whole thing. But yeah, objectively, which movie works better from start to finish? It is the theatrical cut. I can't sit here and argue otherwise. The thing about the reversal of time, it's your point. In Superman the movie, again, you get why he's doing this. Lois is dead, and it's a short period of time that he's going back. Here, Lois is sad, and there's been some property damage. Not great, but it doesn't warrant reversing time by days, weeks. I mean,
who knows? And the villains get put back in the Phantom Zone. What? And
I know you heard the first part of this Donnerverse event where my perspective on this depiction of the character has shifted for the better. I don't still have some of the same problems that I had before, where I've in the past been looking at the Christopher Reeve Superman through the lens of the modern incarnation of the character that I grew up with, where Clark is who he is and Superman is what he can do, as the line goes. And I can appreciate in these movies that Superman is really who he is. Clark is this disguise, and he's not this man grappling with the powers of a god. He's a god living among men, and he's reminded of that by Jor-El at numerous points throughout this. You are not one of them. You may live among them, but you are not one of them. And so that put a lot of this into focus for me. It made me understand why the character was presented in this way, and it works. I really think in this context, in these movies, it really works. But with the reversal of time at the end of this, this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's like he is like this god for whom time is his plaything. It just becomes this weird thing, especially when you look at the movies together, and it's just like, it just feels like a do-over, and it's no big deal.
The Superman, he does two things. He reverses time and he throws stuff into space. That is what the Christopher Reeve Superman does. And even the Brendan Routh Superman, he's throwing stuff into space. That's how we solve all of our problems. So yeah, it just cheapens the stakes when you know, like, well, I guess he can do this anytime he wants. And to not have and of course they don't have the footage. I get it. But like, to not have like the decision being made, you just see toothpaste going backwards and then cut to stock footage of Superman flying around the earth. They even had to reverse some, right? They had to flip some shots. So he's got the Bizarro S on, right? Because they he was happy when he was fixing it the first time going the other way, but we didn't show him happy reversing it this time. I'm like, come on, guys. It is a epic fail of a decision making, in my opinion. And the stock footage from like 2006 or something, people on the street,
yes,
sticks out so poorly. So you know what that reminded me? That whole sequence reminded me of like a History Channel documentary about something, right? Or it's, you know what I mean? Like Life After People. And it shows like this, just the way it was presented. And it's because they took some stock footage and did some rudimentary CGI. I don't know what the budget was on this, to be honest. Clearly it wasn't very high because there's some questionable CGI in there, but it just, the entire presentation of it just falls on its face. And had been able to see, because I believe in the original intention was, Lois was going to get killed by the Phantom Zone criminals, but also the world was going to just be so messed up. Like he sees like all this destruction, and I mean, yeah, the Statue of Liberty got messed up, but you can fix that, and I don't know. So that's where we are. But we've been we're kind of heavy on the leg. This is where I don't like. Let's pull back and let's talk some positives here, Anthony, about the Donner cut.
Yeah, and I will say that's really the main problem that I have with it. So I think a lot of the rest of this will be more positive, but I'm glad we spoke about it up top, because I think that we've set the table for not liking the ending. And so when we talk about Clark going back to the diner, for example, we all understand, right, in the context of the Donner cut, that makes no sense because those events never happened. So he goes to teach this guy a lesson who has never met him for all intents and purposes. So we've established that now. So, we don't have to keep beating up on that aspect, I guess.
I will bring that Donner scene up again later, but yes.
Let me ask you, let me jump to a Smallville question before we get even deeper into Superman 2. Like I said, it's a perfect episode to talk about the ways in which the Donnerverse influenced our favorite show. And most notably, perhaps, is the casting of Zod actor Terrence Stamp as the voice of Jor-El, who we hear on Smallville from seasons 2 through 10. Now, the characterization of Jor-El on Smallville was a harsher, more critical, more domineering version of the character than we've gotten in virtually any other incarnation. And that characterization, coupled with the casting of Terrence Stamp, I remember the speculation, and I'm sure you do, a lot of speculation among fans at the time that it wasn't actually Jor-El, that it was Zod, some sort of trick. Do you remember this? Was it speculation that you shared in? What were your thoughts at the time?
I remembered this, and I thought, fans have their fun theories, and it's always fun to speculate about these sorts of things, but I never really bought it. I thought, no, this is a legacy casting. Christopher Reeve is not playing Superman. Terrence Stamp is not playing Zod, and Ed O'Toole is not playing Lana, right? I mean, a precedent had been set. Now, because this Jor-El in Smallville was so antagonistic, and he's like, "Come to me, Kal-El." I'm like, oh wow, like it really does sound like Superman 2 now, right? That I understand why people, and they could have done that if they really wanted to. Like, well, Zod corrupted the AI of the ship, and I'm your true dad. They did, again, Smallville, you heard us talk about it in our previous episode. They ran so long, they tried a lot of different things. So at first they're like, and I find that the more fascinating take, honestly, on Jor-El. It's like, you know what, we're doing something new here. This is not the Marlon Brando, I've sent you my only son Jor-El thing. This is an alien culture with a whole different philosophy. And you know what, maybe they did think, you know what, I'm going to send my son here who's going to rule. Great. And then you have Jor-El over here and Lionel over here for Clark. and Lex, and that's like, oh, that's so cool. And it even reinforces why the Kents are the difference maker for Clark, because it's like, people say like, oh, well, it's the Kents are what made Superman. It's like, yeah, but then he's got Jor-El telling him like, hey, you're gonna, especially in these movies, for example, like you're gonna go save the world, right? I'm like, oh, okay, great. Now Smallville did some, I won't call it course correction. It was just like they changed kind of what they were doing. How much of that is because of Superman Returns, we'll never know, right? Because before Superman Returns, Smallville was about geometric shapes and caves, and then it was a Fortress of Solitude with crystals, literally showing you stock footage from Superman the movie, So it existed in this weird space there, but no, I thought the voice of Terrence Stamp is fantastic as Jor-El, especially for what they were going for earlier. Even if you're not a Superman fan, he's got a cool, commanding voice. It's like he is a guy that you could never see and still feel his presence, right? Which is, as much as I love Superman and Lois, the current show as of this recording, I have not been too impressed by either of the parents, honestly. Jor-El, they're fine. They exist. They are just plot points. They are just like, I am your holographic father. That, like, I don't get any kind of gravitas or anything from either of them. And it really makes me appreciate the Terrence Stamp Jor-El even more from Smallville, because even though we never saw him, he was a presence, right? And when he interacted with Clark, it meant something. And now it's just like, hey, here's my holographic mom, and she's doing scans on people, and my holographic dad's over here. Now I like the story of Superman and Lois and what they're doing. Just the presentation is lacking. So that's a very long answer to your question there, Anthony.
No, it's all good. I share your view on Superman and Lois. Love the show. Not the biggest fan of their Jor-El or Lara, in particular the Jor-El. Gravitas is the perfect word. That's exactly what I was thinking as you were laying that out. If there's a certain weight that's just not there, and I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe because we see him so clearly, full-bodied. It's a hologram, but he's basically there. One of the episodes with the flashback one where he's asking Clark, "Oh, how was your wedding?" It's just like, I don't know. It's too
so strange, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a little
so strange.
It was a little weird. There needs to be more distance, right? The floating head or the disembodied voice that we got on Smallville. I felt like that works better. As far as Smallville, yeah, I don't remember ever thinking like, oh, it might really be Zod. I remember reading that on the Krypton site message boards. I don't know that was something I necessarily shared in, nor would I have wanted it. I think that I agree with everything you said about the roles of the parents in the show and the difference that they make. And this depiction of Jor-El reinforced that. And also, look, it created a lot of tension. I think that's probably one of the reasons the show was able to go as long as it did. If everything was great between Clark and Jor-El from the jump, you don't have as far to go. So they got a lot of mileage out of that tension all the way up until the final minutes. I mean, it really took until the final minutes of the show for Jor-El to truly come around and embrace his son and give him those words that Clark had so longed for.
Mm-hmm. It's a great conclusion to that arc, if you will, for Clark and Jor-El, and I love the sentiment, but the way he says the line is so funny. He's just like, "It is Jonathan and Martha Kent and all the people in Smallville that made you who you are." Which, that's such a strange thing to say. It's but that line always stuck out to me. Like, and all the people there. Just, I don't know. To think about that Jor-El from like rule them with strength, right? Here's a brand, right? And then he's talking about like, yeah, these people are great, right? By the way, I met them in the 60s, or at least their parents, and they were cool. But anyway, no, I agree with you. I don't think I would not have liked that twist either. Superman and Lois would totally do a twist like that, though, wouldn't they? Like, oh, you thought I was this character? Well, guess what? It's not. Like,
as of this, this is just a quick tangent. As of this recording, one of my buddies messaged me to ask about the Ali Alston character, who's figuring on prominently on the show this season. By the time this airs, maybe we'll have an answer. But he was like, "Oh, I heard maybe she's this person, maybe she's that." I was like, "Look, with this show, anything could happen. They love a bait and switch. Even if you think it's going to be one person, it's probably someone else." So I really couldn't say. It could be anybody. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely cool having him on the show as that voice. Great voice. And I agree with you. The fact that we don't see him in any capacity in the Fortress, you really need a voice that has that weight to it. And his certainly does. As far as other ways in which the Donnerverse impacted Smallville, I mean, certainly the visual representation of the fortress, the throwing of the crystal at the end of season 4 that gives rise to the fortress, the musical cues that we get throughout the series until we build to the big finish in the series finale. I mean, what were some of the other things? Some of the legacy casting, of course. In addition to Annette O'Toole, of course, we had Christopher Reeve and Margot Kidder pop up, and Mark McClure. I mean, there were a bunch of examples. But anything else that really stands out to you as the Donnerverse brought to life on Smallville?
Well, I think Al Goff and Miles Miller even reference, right? Hey, that Superman the movie Smallville sequence, right, is what we kind of based our show off of, which, like, sentiment wise, yes. I mean, like, there were no meteor freaks, meteor showers and stuff. Then it's a very more small town America thing there, right? But like Glenn Ford has such a small role, but such a powerful role, right? Of like, you're here for a reason, right? He gives him that speech and all that, and then has his heart attack, right? And it's very similar. It's a very different situation, but it's actually still very similar to how Jonathan Kent dies in Superman the movie and in Smallville. Like where he, just has a heart attack and he dies, and right there in front of Martha and Clark, and it's a very powerful moment there. And the whole, like, Clark is kind of a, in the earlier seasons, I mean, even not that long of the show, but like I always enjoy the Clark where he's kind of like the kind of awkward outcast, but outcast by choice, because like he's like, oh, I don't really fit in here. I can't play sports. I can't do this. I can't do that. Right. That vibe, I responded to that vibe as a young person, right? And I'm like, yeah, right. Like, we're all outsiders, just like Superman, right? And even though if you're not the captain of the football team, you're Superman. They just don't know it, that kind of thing, right? So the whole like Clark getting picked on by the football team thing worked. Like the Whitney character is the Brad character, more or less, right, from these movies. And like that kind of, and like there's lines from Smallville that are straight out of here, right? In season 1, like Jonathan. Episode Nicodemus, I'm going to drop some Smallville knowledge on people, right? Jonathan has like a fever and he's dying in the hospital, and Clark's like, all my abilities and there's nothing I can do to help him, right? And when Clark wants to play football, Jonathan says you're here for much more important things than winning football games, right? These kind of themes, right? These so definitely, especially early Smallville, they're really basing it off of a small sample size, but still it leaves an incredible impact, right? So I think you see all those things in Smallville. And that's why I was never a fan of him playing football on Smallville. I'm like, no, clearly established in your blueprint, Superman the movie, that he should not be a football star. But again, hey, post-crisis he was, and there are many interpretations, and that's fine if that works for you. I prefer the Superman and Lois where his dad wouldn't even let him play baseball. I'm like, yes, that's the correct parenting if your kid has superpowers.
Can't even play a non-contact sport. It's just no sports for you.
But then I guess... something that very, applicable to the Donner Lester cut conversation is like Superman's intimacy with others, right? In the Donner cut, right? Him and Lois consummate their relationship before he gives up his powers. In the Lester cut, it's after. So the Lester cut kind of implies, and you guys touched on this as well, I think, in your conversation. The Lester cut implies like, well, I can't be with human women if I am a superpowered man. Right. And so that's kind of, it's not said, but it's implied through the series of events. Right. And here, and I remember this was some of the buzz back then. Remember this came out like pre-Superman Returns, or it was like concurrent with Superman Returns, right? The Donner cut. They're like, oh, well, he had sex with Lois before he gave up his powers. And so the kid in Superman Returns is going to be his and have powers. Right. That was all the conjecture. And that's your own that's for you to have about Superman Returns in a couple episodes. But it's like, that movie doesn't even recognize Superman 2. They like, it's very complicated. So this technically should have been when Lois got pregnant with Jason. But then if you reverse time, that's a problem because it never happened. Then if you do a memory kiss, that's an even bigger problem because how did I get pregnant with your kid? Right. But that's not for us to discuss today. So, but those are just things I thought about. I bring it because Smallville had the whole like subplot with like, well, I have my powers now, I can't be with Lana and this and that, and that was a big fact. We actually talked about when you were on my podcast talking about Persona, the episode with Bizarro, where that was a thing with Lana and Bizarro, and it wasn't for Lana and Clark, and that was just very it was a subplot of Smallville on and off for a while, and that's not addressed straight on here, but you could kind of see the connection there somewhere.
We'll be back in action in just a moment following these words about our sponsors. Acme Comics is a locally owned and operated full-service comic book store in Greensboro, North Carolina, for people of all ages and walks of life. Since 1983, this 9-time Eisner Award nominee uses their collective knowledge and resources to connect you with the best material available. They pride themselves on their significant contemporary and vintage back issue selection. Mail order subscriptions to new releases are available, and all offerings are available to anyone, anywhere via mail order. Follow Acme on social media and eBay, listen to the Acme Cast on all podcast services, and visit acmecomics.com for much more. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. I am an alum of these festivals, and I found them to be very enjoyable and well-run events. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news and updates about events, discounts, ticketing information, and more. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. A great friend of this show is one of our regular guests, Justin DeVoe. In recent years, Justin has embarked on a truly remarkable fitness journey, which you can see for yourself on Instagram at RealLifeLobo. And if you're looking for guidance in starting or continuing your own fitness journey, check out at Iron and Honor on Instagram. Flat Squirrel Productions is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions to save 10% on your order. Again, that's promo code FSP. It helps support the show too. Thanks. It's funny because it's subtle in a sense, but yeah, when you look at the sequence of those scenes in the two cuts, you're 100% right. In the theatrical cut, he seemingly has to give up his powers first in order to bed Lois. So that conveys the sense that he is not physically able to engage in that act with a human being. Now, on the one hand, I think it makes wanting to give up the powers more, it's a cleaner, simpler, maybe more understandable and digestible dilemma and choice. It's like, well, he wants to be with her literally, and he can't do that unless he gives up his powers. I've never liked that take, and I did not like that Smallville used it until they didn't, right? They for these few seasons where he's like, I can't have sex with Lana, and then I think we might have even talked about it. Yeah, I think we did talk about this specifically when I was on your show. But, there's one of like season 9 episodes when Clark and Lois are dating at this point, and they go to the bed and breakfast with Oliver and Chloe. And, Chloe says something like, oh, like, I thought you and Lois, like, I thought you couldn't be with a woman. And he was like, well, I've been training with Jor-El and I figured out how to use my powers. It's like, what?
Good on them for addressing it.
At least they addressed it, yes.
Because how many threads on the internet would have been like, well, this started season 5, blah, 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 blah. But it is kind of like, well, how does that work? I don't even, good. You know what? You addressed it. We'll move on. But it's just, how do you train for something like that in the Fortress of Solitude? I don't know.
I mean, that's the scene. Wouldn't you have loved to have seen that scene? Oh, man. Because it's like, does Jor-El bring it up? Is that part of the lesson? Your compatibility with humans. Does Clark bring it up? He's like, look, man, I've been depriving myself for years. Like, can we work something out here?
Education Crystal 108.
Yeah.
Human intimacy.
So I never really liked the way that played in the Lester cut, even though, again, I do think it's simpler. What we get in the Donner cut is much more interesting. And this is one of the things I wanted to unpack with you, because here he does sleep with Lois first, and then he has this conversation with Jor-El. And Jor-El essentially tells him, you can't serve humanity and invest your time and love with a human. And then Clark says, well, what if I don't want to serve humanity anymore? And apparently retaining his powers, but simply not being Superman, like, that's not an option here. It's one or the other as far as how Jor-El sees it. And he says, if you want to live as one of them and love one of them, then it follows you must live as one of them, be one of them. And of course presents him with this chamber that will bombard him with red sunlight and remove his powers permanently. This cannot be undone. I mean, what is your take on this? And obviously this, we have to have a movie here, and this is going to set up the rest of it. So like it has to happen. But this notion that it has to be one or the other. If he wants to be with Lois, he has to relinquish his birthright, his powers, the Kryptonian part of himself.
I think it might play into the whole pre-crisis of it all, because obviously in post-crisis they've found this balance, right? Because Clark is the one who gets engaged to Lois and dates Lois and those kinds of things. It's not just the whole Superman angle, and like the whole identity thing. Because Jor-El even says, "If you will not be Kal-El," it's like, well, he is Kal-El, right? I mean, the whole Superman's what I can do, Clark Kent is who I am thing. It's eloquently put in Lois and Clark, which is like the mission statement for Superman, I think, post-crisis, and rightfully so. It's because if I was Superman, I'd be like, okay, well, I'm just going to leave and do whatever I want and not talk to you anymore. Right? It's like, so what, you don't have some like control over him, Jor-El. I mean, it's not,
this is not the Jor-El of Smallville. The Jor-El of Smallville would have frozen him and it would have been a whole thing.
Right. Branded him and frozen him and, trapped him in there. But I see, like you said, you have to have a movie, right? You have to have the conflict and stuff. And I don't know. I was more taken aback by this version's, like, he's like, after all I've done for them, like, come on, man, I deserve some happiness. I'm like, whoa, what do you like? That's very selfish attitude. I'm like, teenage Clark can feel that way on Smallville, but not Superman. You just started. Like what? Like Superman, the Superman 2, the Donner cut is like, immediately after, right? Like you've been Superman for a week, a month. Like, well, just, I like to, in my head canon, I feel like a little more time passed in Superman the movie. Like he had like some adventures and like between like the first interview with Lois and them in the desert with Lex Luthor and the missiles. Like he just doesn't say that or anything, but you can assume that if you want, whatever, right? But he's been Superman for a very, very brief amount of time in order to want to give up his powers. For no real reason. Like Spider-Man 2, let's bring in a different franchise, like Superman 2 walked so Spider-Man 2 could run. Like it took this, like, okay, like he loses his powers, but it's not really his choice. He's just being overwhelmed with life. And then he's like, you know what? Life isn't so bad without my powers. And then he realizes, oh no, I need it's a journey, right? It's a whole sequence, right? As opposed to this one, which Superman 2, both versions, as you guys mentioned in your conversation before. I mentioned it not to just repeat you, but just to let you guys know, go check out that, not the retread, but like, yeah, it would have been more interesting to have more of him dealing with that choice as opposed to, I got beat up once. And that's great scenes, great stuff, right? But just to have more consequence, because like, much like, we're talking about turning back time, there's no consequence really. Yeah, his consequence for losing his powers is the Jor-El has to give up his life energy, right? So, I mean, that's a big deal if you're Superman and you spent like 12 years with him in the fortress and that kind of thing, right? This Jor-El is a bigger part of the Superman's life than probably any other Jor-El. But it just, I don't know. I don't follow that on either front of like, you can't be a Kryptonian and like the intellectual, like not intellectual. What is it? I don't know what the right word for it is, but it's just like Jor-El's thinking of like, no, you can't do that. Well, why? Well, because I said so, because that's where we are with that choice. So
yeah, it's so interesting. And I think where I was more frustrated with it before, I'm more intrigued by it now and what it means. And I might be looking for meaning that isn't really there, but nevertheless, I've really been thinking about it. Now, one quick thing, when you mentioned that when he says like, haven't I done enough for them? It felt more like Smallville. Just going back to what you were saying before, I agree totally about a lot of the ways in which that Smallville sequence and Superman the movie informed the Smallville TV show thematically and even in terms of specific dialogue and plot points. I agree with all of that. But it's funny because the Clark in that Smallville sequence in Superman the movie, he wants to use his powers to play football, right? That's that initial tension. He has to kind of hide, right? And he's getting made fun of and he wants to play football. And we see that play out on the TV show, but it was the Superman 2 and the Donner cut in particular, the scenes with Jor-El that so made me feel like I was in that Smallville world. And that felt to me like the even bigger influence, even though I know Smallville was already well underway before this Donner cut, even came to light. But just this idea of him wanting to live a normal life and being willing to give up his powers, it just felt like, this feels very in keeping with what we got on Smallville for so long, and then got it again in Crisis. But that's a separate conversation.
Right. I wasn't gonna bring up Crisis. I know. but that's the ultimate endpoint for Smallville. So, yeah, and side note, this is a great Smallville comparison too. Tom Welling evolved as an actor over the show, right? He does some amazing emotional stuff in the latter half of the show season one, Tom Welling, to his own admission, was like, I wasn't the best actor or whatever, right? Christopher Reeve definitely grows as an actor between like the initial shoots, and in my opinion, the initial shoots of this, because the Marlon Brando scenes were, I think, the first ones they shot. And that's why, and if you see the extended version of Superman the movie, that's why he looks so like, I would say skinny. I mean, like average, he doesn't look like the sculpted, amazing, straight out of the comics guy he does later in the movie that he does there, right, talking to Jor-El. My point being, that sequence, and then especially the repowering sequence, right, where he goes back to the fortress, like so much, like the repowering, the lead up to it, where he goes back to the fortress and he's sitting there just like pleading to nothingness. He's like, mother, father, like I failed. And he just cries out, like, father, right? Like that is a far more effective scene because it says less, like it's because like the Donner cut, he talks, he's like, the people of Earth are subjugated to a world ruled by your enemy, blah, blah, blah. That was not the time for that, man. Like you're a desperate guy right now. Like, and even the visuals, right? Like the fortress in the Lester cut is all like dark and green and depowered and all that. And the Donner cut looks exactly the same. Like, I feel like there's been no like restoration of it as there has been. So just thinking about these scenes with, Clark and Kal-El talking to Jor-El, it's kind of where my mind goes right now. So.
No, I guess this is where we differ, because those scenes before and after the depowering in the fortress, those really worked for me. And as I've said before with the Donner Reeve incarnation of the character, one of the walls that I've kind of hit sometimes is what I've seen to be this lack of internal tension. And I talked about this with Superman the movie. You really don't get a lot. I mean, that movie is far more about this epic journey, which is awesome. And there are moments of tension when he loses Pa and he can't save him, when he, wants to tell Lois his secret, but he doesn't. And then, of course, at the end where he is pulled between the advice of his two fathers. That's where you see it most. So it's there. I don't want to make it sound like this guy's got nothing to deal with, but it's not the driving force of the movie. But I got more okay with that, again, with this sense of, okay, it's more about the journey. He's this God living among men. I can get on board with that. But what I appreciated here is I felt like this kind of struck a nice balance, and I did like that tension as he was pleading with Jor-El. The whole bit about, like you were saying, that, haven't I done enough for them? Will it ever be enough? I guess I'm a little split because I like seeing that side of him, and it's a different side of him than you typically see, though I do agree it feels a little out of place, especially where we are at this point in the story. But I guess it's all relative. He has done a lot. He hasn't had the years-long career that, we've seen in the comics, but I don't know. I didn't mind so much.
Tom Welling was Superman longer than Christopher Reeve was at this point when he gave up his powers.
Well, that's true. Yeah, actually, maybe that makes me a little bit more okay with Crisis then. You're right.
There you go. That's the journey, man. You're going to go on that same journey. I look forward to you coming around on that. But the conflict, right? The Superman. And, I really love what you guys said, the kind of unlocking, like, this is why this Superman might be so universally loved forever, or just still, right, as like people gold standards say, because it's like, yeah, he's just a superhero who loves being a superhero and does the right thing and shows up and he's super powerful and does his thing, and it's that wish fulfillment fantasy, like that kind of inspired Superman to begin with, right? Not to say that there's no, there's different shades of Superman. Like to me, Batman is a much more malleable character than Superman. So you can get all these shades of Batman, and people are like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, Adam West or Frank Miller or whatever, right? But Superman, it's like, it seems his world is malleable, but he is less malleable. And I feel like in the public consciousness, they have a very specific idea of what he is. And you start messing with that and people get upset, and that's, just go look on the internet and see. But that's interesting, right? Because that is something that, outside of the Donner cut, you really don't see moving forward from Christopher Reeve Superman. You see the evil Superman 3, but that's its own offshoot kind of thing. And then in Superman 4, he's just like, I'm decided to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Like, okay, oh, great. Good for you, man. Like, so, and if, I guess I guess there's two lines of it. It's like, would he feel more like jaded at the beginning of his career because he's still kind of maturing? or would he feel more jaded at the end because he's lived through so much stuff? I guess if I had to choose, I would pick the beginning because you're still maturing. You know, you lack the wisdom of like, well, I know this is hard, but there's a reward and all. That's what Jarrell tries to tell him. He's like, hey, man, like, what about you? Felt good about this, right? He's like, well, yeah, but I want to be with Lois more. But he still has to admit that there is a certain higher happiness, right, that he's aspiring to, that he gets from being Superman.
Right. And that's the other thing. And I don't say this to be flip, but putting this in perspective, he's just had what we can assume is his first sexual experience. And not just a random one, but with someone he has genuine, deep affection for. So I have to imagine that he's standing there minutes later, it seems.
He's riding that high.
He's right. You know, so I mean, I have to imagine that's fueling maybe some of that, the brashness, if you want to call it that you might not typically see. So again, I definitely appreciated this different side of the character. Does it totally track, especially given how early in the journey he is? Maybe not. I think that's debatable. But as far as this whole notion of it's one or the other, again, I think this view of the God among men, and especially the biblical aspect of all of this, and what Jor-El even says about this higher calling, this higher purpose and happiness that you should seek. Again, when you think about it, and this is where it's hard to separate everything else we've seen, right? Because we've seen and read so many stories now where he is a superhero and he's dating and he's engaged and he's a husband and he's a father. So it's like we've seen all of these instances where it's like, no, clearly he can do both. But I can get past that, I suppose, and recognize, like, in this version of the story, the way Jor-El sees it, it's one or the other. Now, why Clark? And that's the other interesting thing, I guess. I hadn't really thought about this before, but I guess those 12 years that he was getting trained were so formative, because you do kind of, like you were saying before, it's like, well, why doesn't Clark just say, well, you know, I'm just going to leave? I don't think that's the relationship he has with this AI. You know, clearly there's obviously a lot of respect, and he, you know, pleads with him in a way that he technically literally doesn't need to, because Jor-El doesn't have the power over him, but he's so deferential to his father and to what his father thinks and prescribes for him. It's a different take. It's not one, you know, look, Tom Welling's Clark was always butting heads with Jor-El, no problem. But, you know, in this take, it's like, I can get it, I guess. I can get on board. What do you think?
Yeah, and it had, like you said, there have been so many versions after that have, like, not even considered this as, like, a dilemma, that were like, oh, well, then what's the problem? But you get 1980, when this would have come out for the first time, what do you have? The George Reeves show and the movie serials and the comics, where there's always the permanent love triangle to never be resolved, right? So this would have been forging new ground, right? And like, oh, well, this is interesting. Could Superman just be himself? And you know, visually it is, you know, cool just to see Christopher Reeve in the Superman hair, but in like normal clothes. Like, yeah, that's an interesting kind of in-betweenness that you really don't see anywhere else. And it's a good look for him, right? And to throw a little more positivity on it, right? Because I know I had been kind of leaning more negative at the beginning. The depowering here, other than the terrible stunt double, which dude looks like Gerard Christopher, by the way, from Superboy. It's not him, but I mean, why did they have so many shots they use this guy? And I'm like, you could have just obscured his face a little more, but it's like, no, you clearly see that you're not Chris Reeve. Anyway, I was never really the biggest fan of, like, the whole, it was very 80s, the Lester version of the depowering. Like, we're going to see your skeleton and we're going to use stock footage from Superman, the movie, of him in the fire, which at the time, no one had seen that footage. So that's very interesting in of itself. Luther's gauntlet going through the fire, skeleton, all that stuff, because you know what? When the villains get their powers taken away at the end and they switch it, that doesn't happen to them. So this tracks better. The Donner depowering tracks. It looks better, more slick, and it tracks better with the switcheroo at the end. And then it's the strange, like, you know, in the Lester version, like, there's Superman fades away and Clark comes out. It's strange, right? But this is, you know, the force just blows up here, you know. And Jor-El's kind of pissed at Lois. Yes, right? Gives her that kind of glare, which is interesting, right? I like that edge to it, right? So, that works.
Yeah, I was on board with the way it was executed here. I thought that worked fine. And I guess too, as I'm still sorting through all of this, the other piece about just why he even needs to do this in the first place, I guess it calls to mind when we're talking about the biblical aspects of all of this. I know it's a movie and not the Bible, but the last temptation of Christ, right? Where it's this opportunity, right, to live that normal life. And it's again, in that movie, he's on the cross when he's tempted with this. So it's not, the same sort of circumstance, but still this opportunity at a life. And it's not about having both. It's about sort of one or the other. I mean, and actually, this other thing about it could have forged new ground with the romance. I mean, I would say it did. I mean, the fact that it even dealt with the romance in a meaningful way, right? Like the George Reeves show, like there were maybe one or two instances where they even touch on that. It's not a part of it. In the comics, like you said, they always play with the triangle, but never resolved and never move forward in a meaningful way. So it's like here, yeah, if they had allowed him to be Superman and to be in a relationship, that would have been great. And that would have lined up with what we are familiar with and what we know can work. But in this context, it's like, at least they went as far as they did. And I feel like in that sense, that was new ground. So I do appreciate that, at least. Where both cuts of the movie fall short, I think, are wrestling with the decision to give up the powers. Even like, and since we're especially talking about the Donner cut, we see him lying in bed with Lois, and then he's at the crystal chamber, right? We don't see anything else. There's no conversation with Lois, which, not he makes this unilateral decision that's a monumental one for both of them and the world, and never discusses it with her.
She's like, I don't want a bodyguard. I want the man I fell in love with. Like, well, Lois, I wish you were here. We should have talked about this. Then even later they say that, and I'm like, yeah, you guys should have talked about this.
Should have talked about this. So the lead up to it, I would have liked a little bit more. And what follows, and in both cuts, it's the same thing. It's like one scene at the diner, and he gets beat up, and he sees the news report of Zod, and it's like, oh, I've made a terrible mistake. I have to go back. Like, there's so much more that I would have loved to have seen.
Decision, Anchorman,
or Arrested Development. It's like, I made a huge mistake. It's like it's instantaneous, and I feel like it would have had more impact had we spent more time with powerless Clark. And kind of on that note, I was curious what your thoughts were on the overall structure of this movie and the Donner cut in particular, because we get a rather lengthy previously on sequence at the beginning of this. It goes on for a while. I was surprised, even though I rewatched it fairly recently, but I'm like, oh, it's like a lot of scenes from Superman the movie to give us context, even though we don't need it, but the movie gives it to us. And then the first good chunk of the movie is really following three disparate threads. They will come together, but we have Lex escaping and going to the fortress and learning about the Kryptonian criminals, which ends up being largely pointless, I would argue. We can circle back to that. We have Lois figuring out Clark's secret, and then we have the Kryptonian criminals emerging, tearing through those poor astronauts, and then their small town rampage. But I felt like there was not, and I know it was a lot of setup and it would eventually come together, but it just felt a bit meandering for the first good bit of the movie. What did you think?
Yeah, I think this is another factor where I prefer the Lester cut, because it does tie together these things. It's like, because when I heard about the Donner cut, I was like, oh, that's so cool. They tied the missile together with the Phantom Zone criminals. That makes so much sense. It's all connected, right? One leads to the other. But then you see this in this very, as you said, drawn out, previously on Superman sequence, right? It's like, that was it kind of went on for a while. Like it was strange that I just assumed that the Donner cut would be like the Lester cut, the theatrical cut, but with Marlon Brando in it at the beginning. Like I thought, like, oh yeah, you're going to do the recap with the criminals, you're going to recap the last movie and the credits, like all that stuff is there. But it's just a very like I don't know if this was part of the script or it was an editing decision or what, but the way they recap Superman the movie was just clunky, right? For lack of a better word. Not very elegant. And then some pretty questionable CGI, if I must say, when they get released from the Phantom Zone. I do prefer, there's something about like, yeah, there's dated practical effects like the 80s. I'm like, that still dates better than this strange, like, again, I go to like History Channel documentary, Sci-Fi Channel original movie kind of level CGI. And again, I don't know their budget. I don't want to keep dunking on them. But it is an XK-101 rocket, not an XK-10 rocket. They left a number off the rocket, and that's annoying. But I know I'm nitpicking. So, but all that to say, there's not any Superman action until Niagara Falls in this movie, Anthony, like outside the recap. And as I understand it, there would have been Donner didn't get any chance to film him, but Superman would have like flown by a jet and stopped like some fox hunters, or there was something for Superman to do before, later on in the movie. And I think that kind of shows, not that I'm like sitting here like, where's Superman? But it is odd. You go like halfway through the movie where there's really nothing going on. And then he gives up his powers, so there's really not much Superman in Superman 2. But I did like the expanded Lex stuff. I liked the expanded Lex stuff. That just even seeing extensions were good. In the Donner cut, more back and forth with Otis was great. I think I prefer Gene Hackman's Lex in 2 than in 1.
I do too. I would agree with that.
Yeah, just he has more shades to him. He's bald for more of it, which is great. Or at least has like a bald cap on. And even, a big change, positives, right? I got positives for this. A change they made for the Donner cut was when they're in the hot air balloon after they escape. They put that in Metropolis right after they escape, and they have him and Miss Tessmacher have that conversation. That conversation makes way more sense happening where it does right after they escape than like, you should go like 100 miles and not just talk about what happened with Otis, in the theatrical cut. Anyway, thoughts I have about the pacing there, and because it does take a while to come together, and the Donner cut too, like even the tweaks they make to like the attack on the moon, right? Like they do a little camera tilt when they fly off that just adds so much more life to that shot. And then just technically, just overall, like because thinking about these sequences, it stuck out to me here too, like. The color timing I much prefer on the Donner cut. It's a cooler, everything's more blue, everything was more like kind of like brownish and almost dingy sometimes looks in the theatrical version. Now that was like of the times, right? I guess like late 70s, early 80s, a lot of those films have that look to them, but I prefer that kind of cooler, cleaner look that the Donner cut has. So those are those are some scattershot thoughts about the beginning, but absolutely as I referenced it earlier, the opening scene, the Daily Planet with Lois and Clark and Perry, right. And her jumping out the window, that is fantastic stuff. And to think we would have never seen that is crazy to me. Right. Because Lois even says like, it took me a while to figure it out. And usually stuff does like this doesn't get by me. And it's only been, we'll say it's been a week, a month. It's been super fast. And she figures this out as she should. And this is probably one of the fastest Lois figures out his secret ever. Right. And yeah, anyone could just draw that on Superman. That's why you shouldn't pose for pictures, Superman, because anyone could do that. And I thought it was fantastic. And their interplay is great. Although not to make this a versus conversation, just more of a hypothetical. What is more risky, Lois jumping out of a building or jumping into Niagara Falls? What do you what's the bigger risk here, you think, Anthony, for her to test Clark's secret?
I mean, if she's wrong, I feel like she'd have a better chance in the water than the bottom of a building. So yeah, this was she was really, but I get that really shows a lot about her character. She was convinced. And of course she was right, but Clark is very committed to the bit, and obviously, super speeds down to the street and uses his super breath and heat vision to cushion her fall. But
heat vision through the glasses, which I always love in these movies.
I know.
You do tilt the glasses down. I guess Dean Cain did that on Lois and Clark, right? He used to tilt the glasses down. Mm-hmm. So that's what even when you're like playing Superman as a kid, you're like, I'm going to tilt the glasses down, but it's like, oh, you're just firing right through those glasses there. So, but they take this sequence and they repurpose it for Niagara Falls, and I like them both, like to different degrees of, but I think ultimate version of the movie aside, I think you do have to not do both because it's so repetitive. Like you have to choose one. And God, I just love this scene, right? I think it's great. And to see Clark do Clark things, or Clark do Superman things as Clark, reminds us of Smallville. We love it. Mm-hmm. But often, he often just turns to Superman to do things. So to see him, as you said, he's so committed to it. He's just super speeds down and does this and that. And I love like, oh, you just stepped out for a while, right? It's great stuff. I love, other than the stunt double and the weird voiceover thing, which I mentioned already. Oh, what have you done down there? You're not Christopher Reeve. Get out of here. But a really fun sequence and a great way to kick off the movie and kind of reintroduce you to these characters. And like one of Perry White's two scenes and Jimmy, I guess. So.
It's true. I got to tell you, one of the things that I thought was so funny to me was when Perry, Clark is talking to Jimmy in the background. And then Perry yells at Lois and Clark to get into his office. And Clark runs away from Jimmy. He's like, I got in trouble. Like, Jimmy, you can't do that. And he's, it's part of his Clark Kent shtick, but there's something about it that just felt so genuine and earnest. And it was so funny to me that he was so upset that he got in trouble with Perry because Jimmy was talking to him.
Right. The little slice of life in the planet. Although I don't know how long this is supposed to take place after Superman 2, because it's like a headline about what happened in California. But Lex Luthor is already in jail. It's kind of fast.
Yeah. I mean, you don't get the sense that much time has passed at all. Not only is Lex fully incarcerated, although, Superman dropped him off at the end of the first movie. I think they threw him right in that cell.
The justice system was different in the late 70s. Okay.
Although he's worked fast because he's already created this projector system and his device to track the alpha wave. So he's
black box is almost ready
very quickly. I agree with you. I think that, and look, you still get the Niagara Falls setting in this movie, but I agree. As far as Lois testing him, I like the scene that we get in the Donner cut. I mean, I love the Daily Planet setting. And like you said, you get Perry, you get Jimmy. I think that was really cool. It was amazing to get to see that.
They even quote Perry in this line in the theatrical cut. Like, Clark's like, Mr. White says that they're charging people for every cent they've got. And I'm like, they literally said that, but in the different version of the movie. So interesting. Here's the theatrical cut, right? We do, time has passed. You kind of imply that more time has passed between the two movies. And Lois and Clark kind of have this friendship, right? Like, it's cute. Like, you kind of see that they have like a true kind of more of a friendship than they had in this version, because she knows she's Superman off the jump here, right? But then they do the whole freshly squeezed orange juice thing, right, in the theatrical cut, and they cut that out of here. But then when we go to Niagara Falls, she's like, "Hey, will you get me some orange juice?" She's like, I know, freshly squeezed. I'm like, what? You guys can't, you got to edit that out. Like, you can't leave in an in joke that's referencing a scene that you deleted earlier in the movie. But anyway, now we're getting in the weeds of the comparison, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
I mean, I'll speak up on the movie's defense. I guess it gives you the sense that, because I had the same thought as I was watching it. I'm like, that doesn't really work. But it was like, it shows, even though we've not seen that other moment about the orange juice, it's like you can fill in the blanks in your head. And it's like, clearly they have this rapport and they know each other this well. So even though you haven't seen it, it's like, that's where that's coming from. I was okay with that. Going back to the Lex stuff, it's funny because I liked Lex's escape. I like Lex in the fortress. Of course, we would see another iteration of that and echoes of that in Superman Returns. But like I said before, it just felt ultimately inconsequential that he goes to the fortress and he learns about the Kryptonian criminals, because it ends up not really, I mean, coincidentally, very conveniently, these are the same Kryptonian criminals who have now just escaped. And then Lex will see them on the news and he'll know to go to the White House later. But I feel like Lex would have done that anyway, even if he didn't have the backstory from Jor-El.
I guess he's able to drop Jor-El, your jailer, the son of Jor-El, that's able to give him an in with them. But that's a good point. Other than his insider knowledge, which seems to at least stop them from killing him immediately. Right. I also feel like I agree with you. I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, well, he knows about Jor-El, but I feel like, you go back to Superman's first interview with Lois in the first movie, and he tells her he's from Krypton. He tells her the one weakness, the one limitation to his X-ray vision. So it's like, I feel like he probably would have mentioned Jor-El at some point and Lex would know that. But no, I agree. I think that does definitely give him the in and turns the tide. If we can buy Lex Luthor figuring out kryptonite, right, we can buy him figuring out Jor-El. That is people have the problem with, people say that Superman the movie's perfect except for the time reversal. I'm like, well, I'd say Superman the movie's perfect except for Lex figuring out kryptonite, where it came from, where to find it, and how it affects Superman. But that's a conversation for another time. In a deleted Donner scene that they did not put in the Donner cut, Lex kind of figures out that his missile is what released the criminals. He's like, it's like, even when you lose, you win. Superman set them free. This is great. And I'm like, if you're going to tie back into that, that would have been important to have. But I don't know. There's something about like, Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor. He's not my favorite. He's not my choice of Lex Luthor, but I enjoy him as Lex Luthor. Right? He has the vibe he has. I got to say, Rosenbaum says he's his favorite, and I can see Rosenbaum channeling that in a lot of his performances. As serious as Rosenbaum gets, he does have a kind of jovialness to him and a jokey nature at times where I'm like, yeah, I can see the DNA between both of them being shared there, and him interacting with Jor-El is fun and that sort of thing. And these are things that we had been like, oh wow, we're going to see Marlon Brando in these scenes, right? And this is part of them. Again, I don't know if it's a budget thing. It was odd the way he was presented sometimes, like as a head kind of just bouncing around, just strange. Because I just like, he's going to be the kind of ghostly head that Superman talks to, I thought. But now he's, for whatever reason, in these scenes and in my headcanon, and it's like, these are the recording crystals. And that's how they look. But when you're talking to the spirit of Jor-El, see, we both got our headcanon stuff going on. We're talking to the spirit of Jor-El. He's this ghostly figure you can interact with, right? So that's on my headcanon solved, because that was kind of an unexpected thing to me. And then also him seeing the villains, right? As kind of, I guess they wanted to kind of spice up the presentation of like, here's what Zod looks like, et cetera. So that was interesting. So,
yeah. No, your points are well taken. I feel similarly about Gene Hackman's Lex. Not my favorite, but very enjoyable. That's kind of where I fall on that too.
And that's probably why we both like him more in this one, because he has to play off the villains. Like there's a bigger threat here.
Yes.
So he never like quite teams up with Superman. They have a couple of moments. Like one of the best moments, he's like, Superman, thank God. I mean, get him.
It's so good. It's such a great moment.
And then at the end too, right? It's like the double crossing. Like, so those moments are great. And he plays off them all so well. That I think that's kind of why I kind of lean toward him more, liking him more in this film than the first one.
That makes sense. That's probably why I do as well. It's funny, when I've talked about Superman 2 before, I took the movie to task for, how the movie presents Clark really as the disguise. And it's like, well, of course it all falls apart when he doesn't have his powers and he gets beaten up, and it's, because this Clark there's no substance to the man. He's just this facade. But like I said, the way I'm looking at it now, it's like, I feel like that's kind of the point or part of the point. And I'm more okay with it. It's like, and it's funny too, because one of the lines that always bothered me was when Lois and Superman are at the fortress having their romantic dinner, and she asks him about being Clark. And he literally says, like, I don't, I kind of like being Clark sometimes, even if I do make a fool of myself. And I remember thinking, it's like, it is just that disguise for you. But it's like, but it is. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I really come to terms with the fact that this is the interpretation of the character here, again, stemming from the pre-crisis comics. And I don't have the issue that I did with it before. And I actually think it does help me enjoy that diner scene more. Cause it's like, yeah, of course this all falls apart. There's nothing there once you've stripped away the Superman of it.
All right. Well, and I guess he doesn't know how to act. So would you care to step outside? This is how tough guys act, right? Yeah. And like, no, he's going to beat you up, man. And I find this humorous, but also authentic. Like when Superman doesn't have his powers, he doesn't know how to fight. He doesn't know how to take a beating. Like he's like, my blood. Like, yeah, he's never seen his blood before because he's never hurt. He's never been hurt other than Kryptonite in the last movie where he got weakened. Right. Like to truly be beat up by somebody. He doesn't know how to fight. We joke about it on Smallville all the time. He throws him 20 feet. That's the end of the fight. Right. And so when you have those powers, right, you wouldn't know. So I get it. Like, I get this might be a little bit of a stretch that it's like he had one hiccup and now he's like, oh, shut it down. I got to go get my powers back. But it was more the Zod thing. He got to get the powers back. It wasn't, oh, no, I bled once and got embarrassed.
Yeah, that's
and I love the whole diner stuff, though. I do. I love the end. I love the end. All right. And so like that's probably strike three against the Donner cut for me, where like the end makes no sense either way. Because like just get on my soapbox here for a second. I'm sorry. No, wait.
Don't go for it. Go for it.
I'm passionate about this, right? So it's such it's the power fantasy wish fulfillment thing to go. Bullies. You want bullies to get a taste of their own medicine, right? And this guy is a jerk, right, at the diner. So Superman comes back. He's like, hey there, right? And then of course all the people having seen this happen before, because like, oh, he's back. They're all, like, hey, I just fixed up this place. It cost me a fortune, right? And everybody knows what's going on. He's like, oh, you're sitting in my favorite seat, right? Like, I don't know. He coming up to him, letting him punch him, breaking his. He doesn't like destroy the guy's life. He humiliates him, maybe breaks a hand, right? But the guy had it coming. And this is a quote that I will always think about. And when he gives the people the money, he's like, "Oh, I've been working out," and he does the whole arm punch thing, and he walks off, and the Superman theme starts. And because Superman, being Clark Kent, being a responsible person, was like, I might cause some chaos, but you know what? I'm going to pay for it, right? Just like when he I don't know if this scene is in this movie actually, but when he turns back into Clark at Niagara Falls, he leaves the money for the hot dogs, right? When nobody's looking. That's the kind of guy Superman is. Actually, I don't think that shot's in the Donner cut, but anyway, anyway, it's not even in there. So on every level, I really enjoy that. I know you guys really were not a fan of the diner stuff in your conversation about Superman 2 before, but that's a comic book. Like, you know what? Good triumphs over evil. You know what, kids? The bullies are going to get theirs in the end. I don't know. It's a fun kind of note to end on. Again, though, in the Donner cut, it makes absolutely no sense because, why would he tell the people that he's been working out if they've never seen him before? They clearly all recognize each other. It's not it doesn't work that way. And what's crazy is Donner filmed this stuff with the intention of doing the time reversal at the end. So it doesn't work in the Donner stuff. It only works in the theatrical cut, in the version it wasn't supposed to be in. It's just crazy to me. It's insane. And anyway, it's just so good. But no, I love it. I think it's a charming kind of bullies get theirs in the end kind of lesson Superman teaches somebody. And then is it that different than, I think it's a lot less extensive than in Man of Steel, where the guy he trashes that guy's truck with power lines, But if there's one consistent I've found, it's Superman is a jerk in all media, because in the pilot of Smallville, Clark stacks Whitney's truck between two other trucks. So anyway, I like Superman with a little edge to him like that. And I've defended the Donner, the Don's Diner scene is Don's Diner, by the way. Richard Donner, you actually see him, little cameo talking about the Donner cut here, walking. That's in both cuts, but you see, I think he's like right when they pull up in the car, you see him walk by. So that's pretty cool. But anyway, there's my defense of the whole Diner thing, Anthony.
No, fair enough. I agree with you. It definitely makes no sense in this cut. The fact that Clark goes back there. I mean, it's funny because I was trying to bend over backwards of trying to come up with a way that it works. It's like, clearly this guy is a jerk generally. So the fact that someone would come in and have an axe to grind with him wouldn't be so shocking to people. But I think no matter how you cut it, it just doesn't work. I think historically, as someone who's watched this movie like yourself my whole life, I've always enjoyed that Rocky gets his comeuppance. And sadly, the actor who played him, Pepper Martin, just passed very recently at the age of, I want to say 85, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay. Wow. Good run though. 85.
But I always enjoyed that this bully got what was coming to him at the end of the movie. And I agree with you. We see in the Smallville pilot and Man of Steel, those were two examples, as you were saying, that I immediately went to, where it is certainly, I mean, they obviously came after, but we have this commonality here across interpretations. I think the problems that I've had with it more, and maybe what I was talking about in that other episode, are just mostly how quickly this all falls apart. I think that was more the thing. I think Ken had more of an issue with, he kept referring to Rocky as this old man who beats him up. I remember that.
These are the things I was talking about. Like, I'm listening to these guys and I like what they're saying, but I 100% disagree with what they're saying.
Yeah, it didn't, when Ken was saying that, I didn't think about it too much in the moment. Then I was reflecting on it after. I'm like, I don't know, was the guy, I don't know that he was that old.
That's how middle-aged men looked in the 70s. Guy was 35 years old.
That's a hard life on the road. It was, really,
that's right. He's a trucker,
So weathered, but yeah, I think it was more.
Oh man,
I think for me, the issue that I had was just how quickly it all fell apart, how quickly Clark regretted the decision. But I do agree. I think in fairness, it is not just that he gets beat up. It is also this news report and the worst possible thing that could happen, this threat from Krypton that only he can protect them from. He is now unable to do that. So I think that does work. What's funny though is I feel like again, I always liked Clark going back and doing what he does to Rocky, but I feel like there's been more of a move. I've seen online people talking about it. I don't know that decision is as well received generally now? What sense do you have? I'm not asking you to speak for all fans, but like, what sense do you have about how people take that?
You know, I could see how it's like a hot take on the internet, because that's what people love to do. Like, hey, you know, this old movie got a hot take on it, right? This thing you always loved. Well, here's why you shouldn't love it, right? I can probably, that's where it comes from, right? Because this the 24/7 news cycle we got to have in all these entertainment articles. I can see some pulling that out, and yet, you know what? Yeah, I guess from someone's point of view, that's a very irresponsible thing for Superman to do, right? But the fact that he left the money. Right? Maybe he dropped some cash on Rocky when he went out the door, right? Here, get your hand fixed up. I don't know. That was a big wad of cash, right? So I have no problem with it. I see if people like have a real problem with it, they're just like looking for a problem with it. But it's just see what it is. This is a action fantasy movie about Superman, right? That, you know, has a nice little button at the end of it, right? To kind of alleviate the tension. It's a heavy movie, right? With what goes on in it. And, you know, and you kind of, so much had probably happened, you kind of forgotten. Like, I can only imagine, like it's sitting in the theater in 1980, right? It's like people probably like when you see him go back, right? We're like, whoa! Like, I can just see that in my head, right? Because they go back to the guy. Never seen garbage eat garbage before, right? I'm like, oh yeah, get him, Superman. Like, that is a crowd pleasing thing,
yeah,
right? And I feel like it still would be today. So that's kind of where I stand on it, and where I think just a general audience would stand on it.
I get that sense as well. And yeah, you know, it's like in the course of this movie, he's dealing with two bullies, essentially. He's dealing with Zod and he's dealing with this other guy. And clearly Rocky is not the main focus of our movie, but you do. And that's why too, that Would You Care to Step Outside works so much better, because you do have that,
yes,
that parallelism between those encounters. And so to have Rocky and Zod, and then to circle back to Rocky at the end. And I agree with you. I think as a viewer watching this for the first time in the theaters or at home, it's like, I don't think you necessarily expect Clark to enact any retribution against this guy. So when he does, it's like, oh yeah, right. He went back. And like, I think
it's kind of like, what would you do if you were Superman? That's what we would do.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And what works too, I think, is the initial scene does an effective job of showing it's not just that this guy beat Clark up, although that in and of itself would be sufficient. But they clearly show this guy is a jerk. He's rude to everyone. You know, he's sort of a notorious figure here at this diner when he pulls up. Like, oh,
right.
So, you know, you get the sense this guy is trouble generally. And I agree. I think, you know, he breaks his hand. All right. But other than that, Clark spins him. He puts him on the tray and he shoves him. He lands on the pinball machine. It's not, you know, he didn't totally wreck this guy.
Yeah, and he's got the whole like Looney Tunes eyes. It's kind of played for it's played for like, this was fun, right? Bro, you guys get what we're saying here. It's not like, yeah, Superman kicked that guy's ass and he's like bleeding in the corner, crying or something. No, it's a very like it's a very lighthearted revenge. Okay, so that I will defend that for my dying day. So I'm very happy it's in there.
He didn't throw him in the Phantom Zone or anything like that.
That's right. He didn't crush his hand and then throw him down a bottomless pit. Okay. And then destroy the fort. He kills Lex Luthor in this. Did you know that? He kills Lex Luthor in a Donner cut because Lex Luthor's in the fortress, and then Superman uses heat vision, and the fortress disappears because they didn't include the Arctic police, which, granted, is a kind of ridiculous concept, but this is the world we're living in now, right? Like,
yeah. I can buy that. There's some small law enforcement outpost out there. I can get on board with that. No, I agree. I had the same thought. And I watched the deleted scenes first last night. And then it was like, yeah, because when you see Lois, Clark, and Lex left, I mean, forget the villains. All right. I mean, we know from the deleted scene they get carted off, but we'll put them out of our minds. It's like in the cut, the three of them are still, Lois, Clark, and Lex are still in the fortress. And then it's just Superman and Lois flying away. So it's like, yeah, what happened to Lex? I know it was such an odd choice to omit that. You know, the other deleted scene that ties in with the diner return is the guy at the Daily Planet who Clark bumps into, and he's like, "Why don't you get some more sleep, buddy?" And that reminds what's your take on that? Because it's kind of funny to me that like he needed to be reminded of like, oh yeah, I got to go teach that other guy a lesson.
I guess you can. This is fun to break down and try to figure out. I could see two schools of thought on it. It's like, one, it's like Superman, like if you don't have that set up, it's more fun to like as the whole crowd pleasing moment, like where you kind of see that for the first time. But two, it's like the other hand is like, oh, you're right. There's a bully out there. I need to go kick his ass. Like maybe just to kind of see and you need to be reminded that way is a funny thought as well. And hey, side note on that guy, I just found this out recently in the grand scheme of things. I don't know when, a couple of years ago. That guy who plays that bully at the Daily Planet in the deleted scene is the guy with the boombox in the Joker's gang in Batman 89.
Oh, really? Huh. There's a crossover.
There you go. So anyway, hashtag it's all connected. But again, why are they cutting that scene out? Jimmy shows Clark the new camera, which works either way, by the way. It actually works better if there's not a time reversal because Non crushes his camera. Therefore, he would need a new camera. But with them reversing time, why even put that in there? I don't understand. And then another scene with Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor and Superman, Christopher Reeve Superman, they cut it out. They're already police. He does call him the Smallville Smasher, which might have been a reason why they cut it out.
Yeah, I know. I clocked
because he never
that
knew
too.
his secret identity.
And that's
that would
quite
be cool. Lex never figures out Superman's identity. That would be a cool thread, but that is quite a continuity question mark there. Oh, does he know he's Clark Kent? So maybe they saw that and said we can't include it. But I would hate to lose the whole thing because of that.
Yeah, I agree. I did clock that too when he calls him that. I was like, oh, because Smallville is a small town, so it's it would be unlikely that there was just this random pull that Lex came up with. So yeah, that does raise a larger question. I guess, and this ties back to what we were saying about you could have just ended the movie with with Superman flying away from Lois's balcony. She knows his secret. They're both sad they can't be together. It's a bittersweet note to end on, but it works. And it's same thing here. Maybe Lex calling him the Smallville Smasher, it raises this question: did he figure it out? You can leave some open-ended questions here. I think that's okay. It's we know we don't have another movie to from Donner to resolve all of this, but it's okay. I would have been okay with that. Yeah, the reversal of time again and again, we butt up against that because I think it does create a lot of problems. The scene with the guy, with the bully at the Daily Planet is, I guess the other aspect too is, the one case I would make for it is that part of me likes that he needed to be reminded because otherwise it's he's got a lot going on, but he's stewing on this
for later. I'm really going to come back to this guy. That's my priority.
Yeah.
I think I agree. If I had to pick a lane, I kind of like how he has to be reminded that maybe that's where I land on it after all. It's oh yeah, you know what, that guy, you know what, I should probably teach that guy a lesson because these guys are jerks and then somebody better teach you some manners, sir. So I love it when Clark tries to be a tough guy and he's not but he's so polite about it.
Right.
There's just something about that. It's that's how I would like to be a tough guy. If I were teach you some manners, sir. And it's just I don't know. I like it. And that reminds me of way forward, Superman 4, right? Where he's talking to that real estate guy. He wants to sell the farm. He's I'm sorry, sir. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Clark, he's a nice guy, but he's not a pushover. Right. So anyway, there's a lot to be found in the Christopher Reeve Clark Kent. I'm glad you guys are coming around on it. So,
like I said in that other episode, and not to rehash, but the one that we just did a couple weeks ago, he was not quite as bumbling as I've always remembered him in my head. He is, but not quite to the level of caricature that I think I had always remembered it. And even within that, like I said, I just think there really is something very poetic and beautiful about Clark being so overlooked in the exact opposite way that he experiences the world as Superman, and that the way he is neglected and overlooked and put down as Clark gives him that added empathy and compassion in dealing with others who might be in a similar situation when he's Superman. So I definitely have really come around in a big way. And look, it's very funny, and just the way that Reeve is able to create these separate personas in a shockingly believable way.
Yeah, it's charming.
Yeah,
I think that's the ultimate word for it. But you know what? That leads to another point we should talk about. Is the Lois finds out his secret reveal.
Yes.
Where do you land on the shooting him with a blank scene?
So this is one of those instances where, Donner had not filmed this scene, so they had to use the screen test. And so in terms of what plays out on screen, it's not, we would have ended up with a much more polished, refined scene that would have fit in more with the look and feel of the rest of the movie. So sort of taking that with a little bit of a grain of salt, just the idea of how she finds out. I think it's tough because we grew up with him falling into the fire in the hotel room at Niagara Falls. And I do still always love his reaction after that. When he realizes like, all right, I got to give this up.
He starts like, like he starts to say some nonsense and he just stops himself and walks off. So good.
So I like that, but I do like Lois testing him the way she does with the gun. And then ultimately the trick of it was only a blank. So I think mostly I land on the side of Donner, but I really, really love Clark's reaction after the fire in the Lester cut. What about you?
Yeah, it's one of these things where you have the production value that's always like, well, they're screen tests. And I just wish so bad that like they had the same glasses for Clark, cutting back and forth between the glasses. Now, to be fair, I don't think I mentioned it, but this movie starts out with a disclaimer.
Yes.
Where it's like, this is how we would have intended Superman 2 to come out. Some things had to be pieced together and weren't able to be shot. And so there is a disclaimer for this. But it just, man, way to break the suspension of disbelief when Clark is literally like, his hair, I could even be like, oh, it's shorter, but like the glasses being different, like it's such a thing to stand out. But it's interesting to see. It's just interesting curiosity, though, because these are their screen tests and they're both really good. Like even Christopher Reeve, he's like, you realize, of course, Clark Kent would have been killed. Like he's so on point. You see why they cast this guy as Superman, right? And the concept, I really do like the concept. The double twist is like it was a blank, although it would have been even more fun if it wasn't a blank. Because Lois would have been so sure, much like her jumping out the window, her being so sure she's going to shoot this guy with a bullet. So that's like the production stuff, but narratively, I feel like, it's only the screen test because that's why I don't have any more. But it's such a leap to be like, oh, you figured out my secret, to cut to flying romantically to the fortress. Because the theatrical cut is like, I'm in love with you. He's like, oh, well, we really better talk. Right? I mean, and they kind of have this, yeah, we both better change. They laugh. Like there's some, something to come after that. And as opposed to just like cut to the next scene. And of course the footage isn't there and all that stuff. But narratively overall, I have to lean towards the theatrical version of those things. And also just the whole, like where Lois tells him, like, he's like, I don't know why I did that. And she says, maybe you didn't want to with your head, but you wanted to with your heart. I'm like, oh, that's like that says something. And I like that. And finally, last thing I'll say about it is, not to talk too much about the theatrical cut, but it's like, the famous scene in Superman the movie where he takes off the glasses and he's like, Lois, and then he turns back into Clark Kent, right? All in one shot. You kind of see that same thing happen, but from his back in the theatrical cut. Like he goes up, walks up some stairs and then he kind of like stops shrugging, stands up straight, takes the glasses off, turns around and he's Superman. It's kind of like the spiritual sequel to that. So I hate to lose all that stuff, but there is merit narratively to the whole Lois shooting him thing. So I am torn on that. That's where I kind of land on it.
I had forgotten about the line that you just quoted where she says, maybe you part of you did want to do that and reveal yourself. That is a cool moment. Yeah. It's tough. If we could have seen the fully realized Lois shooting him scene with maybe more connective tissue that would have led more naturally to them in the fortress, I'm sure we would feel differently. But yeah, there really is a lot to like in that Lester scene. I agree. This does become just more of a curiosity. Like when you watch the screen test and it's like, well, okay, like you get the sense of where they were going, but yeah, I mean, it does take you out of it. I can't deny that.
Well, and then including this, right? We cut, I assume this is the logic, including this in the Donner cut, they cut out any other scene that happens in the hotel room. Cause like, well, it doesn't look the same. And we got to prioritize this. So we got to lose the Lester stuff and we hate Lester already. So we got to take all this stuff out. But then you lose so much Clark and Lois interaction. That was my point earlier. Like they have like a rapport, a friendship, like the whole like, well, this bed's moving and little fun things like that. The complimentary couch, other lines from the theatrical version, just even more moments they didn't have to. Like I don't understand why they cut out like the aftermath of the Niagara thing. I'd even forgotten earlier if it was there or not. But like Clark, comes back and he's like, well, I was up getting you a hot dog, all that kind of stuff, right? Like there was no reason to remove that from the Donner cut. And it just to speak, you mentioned pacing earlier too. It kind of throws off some of the pacing. You don't spend enough time with these characters and you're just jumping ahead. I get cutting out things that were contradict. I get cutting out the jumping into the river, right? Because we did the jumping out the window, but like have a little back and forth with Lois and Clark there by the Niagara Falls. So I don't know, like, and that's something I did find like you're missing some of that due to just the kind of cutting it down to the bare essentials. But yeah, I mean, that's really, that screen test. It was one of those things I kind of heard about. I was very intrigued to see. And then you see them like, oh, it's these are screen tests, even like kind of out of focus a little bit, and a cool special feature. And I've heard people say maybe this footage would have been better experience if they just kind of released it all as like scenes or something, right? But I'm like, no, because who's gonna like sit and like, it's like watching deleted scenes, like scene after scene after scene. It's good that it's experienced in this way. It would be a very underwhelming thing to be like, here's a special extra disc of lots of scenes that Richard Donner shot. Like, what would be the point of even making the effort to do this for that, unless you're going to assemble it? So I'm still, despite all my reservations, if you guys have been hearing, I'm on board with them having assembled it this way.
Yeah, that's the thing. And, I definitely get the sense that while I know you prefer the theatrical cut overall, I don't get the sense that you begrudge the Donner cut its existence, right? So it's great that it's out there and it exists. If you could only pick one to watch, would it be that one? I get the sense probably not. And even for myself, as much as there is a lot that I love about it, like I said, I do think the other one is certainly more cohesive and works better from start to finish. But yeah, had they just put out deleted scenes, I think one of the reasons that doesn't work is that so much of what's different about this, especially with Zod and Non and Ursa, is the tone. I mean, Lester inserted so much campy stuff. The battle for Metropolis, for example, when they're using their super breath on the people, and like they played so much of that for humor, like the guy, making a phone call,
guy on roller skates and umbrellas. Yeah, no, that's one of the best changes to this film. For the Donner cut is the Metropolis battle. Absolutely it is, because like they cut out all the just weird slapstick humor. It's just so straight, and you don't need it. Like, right. You don't feel like anything's missing. Like my points earlier, like, well, this is missing and this feels weird. No, this feels totally natural. Like them using the super breath, but it's not like ridiculousness going on. And even like they insert a couple other shots of like, Superman punching, Non and then blowing up a strange change, but sure, like blowing up the Statue of Liberty instead of a random building. Like they rotoscoped Christopher Reeve hitting the Statue of Liberty instead of a building, and then cutting out that woman at the Daily Planet who seems to be like cheering for the other Kryptonians.
Oh yeah,
like, what do you? So straight. The big one's almost as strong as Superman. I'm like, that's why would you do that? And then, do you know what the stakes are here? But even like minor things like that, talking about the tone of the villain's like he growls, but it's not like this comedic, almost level animalistic growl. It's like a very like, a human being or, whatever, Homo sapien, whatever he is, could make that noise. Not like some cartoonish growl as well. And then even alternate takes, like when they come back to the Daily Planet office after, Superman flies off, it's a totally different take and it's all much better. Like Zod, like I like Zod in both, but like it's a very different vibe. He's like, why do you say this to me when you know I would kill you for it? Right? Almost it's very like cold and more like I'm gonna kill you, like for real in the Donner version than it is in the Lester version. I like both lines, but like it's just like I say, it's a very interesting comparison, right? It's a very interesting experiment for these things, and I definitely like cutting out East Houston, Idaho, as much as you can is fantastic. Thank you for doing that. Because I'm from Houston, Texas. All right. So growing up, I'm like, oh, cool. They came to Houston because what are the odds, Anthony, that they'd hear NASA talking to Houston? Okay. Planet Houston. We will go there too. Right. So they go land random somewhere in US, and it's East Houston, Idaho. I grew up thinking that was this movie's interpretation of where I lived. I was like, Houston is the 4th largest city in America. Put some respect on our name. We're not some podunk town. And they did the best they could, like editing out like the bare essentials. And it still gets the point across. I wish, Donner had much bigger plans about like, where they were going to land and take over the world. And obviously that could not be accomplished in the Donner cut, but those things, cutting out the slapsticky nature of the villains and take them more seriously because they're not, doing all these silly things. And they even cleaned up some of the special effects, right? In the town battle, like Zod like blows a flamethrower back at a building. Like those were some weird optical effects in the 80s, but the fire here looked better and things like that. So yeah, absolutely. The villains are improved. And then not to mention the climax at the end with all these made up powers are gone, right? There are no finger beams, there's no teleporting, and there's no cellophane S, which, It's become legendary, right? It's like nipples on the bat suit for Batman, the cellophane S for Superman. Those are have the same energy. So I'm glad they cleaned up all of those things.
Yeah, the thing with like the cellophane or any of the other additional powers or powers that we would see him have in some of the subsequent movies, like rebuilding the Great Wall of China with his heat vision, things like that, that's always bothersome. And so I'm glad that was excised. And, I would not put his ability to reverse time in that same category because I feel like it's he's using his existing abilities, like the traditional set of powers that we know, maybe in a way that we don't typically see, but it's not like, again, ripping off the shield from his S. So
totally.
Yeah. And I was happy to see all of that go. And I agree. The movie definitely benefits from losing the slapstick of it all. And the thing is, it's not like, oh, it's this somber, dead serious affair. There's still a lot of humor, just as there was in the first movie, but it doesn't veer into that slapsticky territory that Lester gravitates towards and that we would see him employ in a much bigger way in Superman 3. So yeah, losing all of that.
You see the seeds of Superman 3 and Lester Superman 2, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately why the theatrical cut of Superman 2 won over so many fans initially and over the years is that there was still enough of Donner in there, enough of a blend, of the two, where even when it veers into the slapsticky territory, it still doesn't go totally over the edge the way then we would see in Superman 3 with that notorious opening sequence, for example.
Yeah, that is basically everything they cut out of Superman 2 can be like just distilled into that opening sequence of Superman 3. So,
yeah.
But, perhaps a controversial question for you, the repowering of Clark, right? Marlon Brando stuff is great. I love to see them interact, right? I think, in a perfect version of this movie, you have the Lester version. To me, you have the Lester version up to when he picks up the crystal and then he puts the crystal in and the Donner version continues. Like, I think that's the best balance there, right? Yeah. Him talking to him, farewell forever, Kal-El, closing the circle, the son becomes the father of the son. That finally explains that kind of riddle.
Right.
I mean, how would you know this was going to happen? This too, I've anticipated. So I guess he did know it was going to happen, but very strange to have the last shot of him Clark just being laid on the ground face down in the destroyed crystals. What, like, strange, right? You think it'd be some flash of light and then we go to the next scene, but like to cut back to that is not very triumphant because it's supposed to be like a triumphant, tragic thing all at once. And it's just, I've never understood that. How did that land for you? Kind of the climax of the repowering.
The only thing that I can think of was the intention to create some doubt or tension as to whether it worked. Because if you leave him face down, it is a little bit more of a surprise than when he shows up outside the Daily Planet. But at the same time, it's like, does anyone really think this didn't work or that he was dead in the fortress or still powerless? It's like, no. So but short of that, what else would the reason be for it? I'd be hard pressed to say why you would leave him in that specific pose in the fortress. I will say, I really enjoyed the way this played out here. I mean, you really see the regret and the shame, within Clark for having made this decision that he has now, come to see the error of his ways and his father was right and all of that.
Look at me, Kal-El, right? That whole thing.
Yeah. Again, I think with either cut, one of my big regrets, I just wish this had played out more and longer, where we could have seen more of the buildup to the decision to relinquish the powers. We could have spent more time with him without his powers. I know, that's not what the movie was concerned about, and I appreciate that they at least gave us the internal struggle that they did. I'll take it. But it would have been nice to see a little bit more of that. But these scenes that we do get here do go a long way. I agree with you. I love that we close the loop on the son becomes the father, and the father becomes the son. I mean, literally now his energy is being used to restore Clark to Kal-El, and in the process, Clark will no longer be able to commune with Jor-El. So there really is this loss. I mean, a couple of things on that. One, like we've talked about in Superman the movie, when Jor-El tries to stop Clark from reversing time, and he's like, you're forbidden to interfere with human history, and Clark does, and nothing happens. There are no consequences here. So I did appreciate in this instance where Jor-El tries to warn Clark about giving up his powers, and Clark ignores those warnings. And now there is a price to pay. And I think what struck me was when you look at in particular, the special edition of Superman the movie, which includes that scene between Superman and Jor-El after the first night, after he's made his public debut. And you look at the Donner cut of Superman 2 with these Jor-El scenes restored. It really ties everything together, because if you just look at the theatrical cut of Superman the movie, we don't see Jor-El again after the training sequence. So you don't know necessarily if Superman is still continuing to have any relationship
is that
with
it
him
or not? Yeah.
And then, of course, he's not in the theatrical cut of 2. So here, between the special edition and the Donner cut, you see that Kryptonian father-son relationship to its conclusion. And I really feel like it ties a lot together there. And as far as him, it's a little, it's a little bit much, where it's like, I hoped you would never ask this question. Yet I anticipated what would happen if you did, and then you changed your mind. But, and maybe this is the father in me, but I really, it was very touching to me that Jor-El had come up with this sort of fail-safe, get out of jail free card for his son. Like, in case you ever screw up, kid, like I've got a way out for you. I got you covered.
Yeah, no. I believe it. I believe it tracks, I mean, he's this all, it's the Smallville Jor-El too, like this omnipresent, all powerful. You have one time crystal, right? Redo that mistake. Yeah. And that is I know it just never occurred to me until rewatching it actually for this, which is crazy, because I've watched various versions of this movie my entire life. Like, you're getting exposed to the red rays from Krypton's sun, and that takes away your powers forever.
Well, it's a lot. Well, Zach, it's a lot of red rays. It's not just like a little bit. It's a lot.
Okay, fair enough. It is a lot. But like, speaking of all these other things, right? We got to put our mind back into 1980, because now, like, how many times do people use weapons against Superman? The red kryptonite, or not red sunlight, put him in a red sunlight prison, or use red sunlight beams against him, or anything like. Had a great episode of Smallville the animated series.
Getting
Superman
ahead of yourself there.
Series about the red light, right? I know, right?
We'll get there.
And then Smallville itself, right, with the red sun. So with the season 9, all that plot. So that's a very common thing, and I find it a very creative thing to use to take away his powers. Kryptonite gets old, right, after a while. So that was a very smart way to do it. And then the whole thing about him giving up his powers is what allows the whole switcheroo at the end, right? Which I think is an incredible payoff to him coming out, kneeling down, crushing his hand. Again, I try to put my mind back in like 1980, like that's a whoa, right? If you're in the theater moment, right? Mm-hmm. Of him crushing his hand and throwing him to his death. Yes. Which is why I never had a problem with Man of Steel is not my preferred interpretation of Superman. But I don't not like it for all the reasons people say they don't like it. Like, it's like, he killed Zod. Jonathan said maybe should let those people die. I'm like, I've seen all this stuff before, right? It's not news to me. Jonathan Kent on Smallville would have totally said that to Clark, right? Anyway, that's not the movie we're talking about. But I say this to say, it is a fun kind of comparison to say, like, I can't believe Superman killed Zod in Man of Steel. I'm like, well, there was a lot more emotional weight to that than him just like killing Zod and just giving a smile and a nod to Lex, and of course they intended him not to kill them. They were supposed to be carted away by the Arctic police and stuff. But anyway, all that to say, Superman has killed Zod before in a movie. Just saying. So.
Yep. No, listen. I'm glad you said it. Otherwise, I would have. But people have heard it from me enough. So no, I agree. And also, it's like, yes, we know from the deleted scene they get carted off, but we don't. That's not in the movie, and it's not in either cut of the movie. So you can use it in your head canon, but I would not count that as the official canon of the movie. And when they fall into the caverns of the fortress, unless he's using his super hearing to check if they're breathing, it's like it really seems like they've died, and he has no reaction to that other than he's very pleased with himself.
Yeah.
And again, people don't bat an eye. This is what
you did with villains. No, this is what you did with villains in big action movies, right? 70s, 80s. I mean, that's why we killed all the Batman villains, right? In the 80s and 90s even. That's what you did. And it was just like an understood thing, and it made sense. But in the Donner cut, he reverses time and they go back into the Phantom Zone.
Maybe that's why he wasn't so concerned about them, because he was like, well, I'm just going to undo all of this anyway.
Which, oh man, oh my goodness. Look, does Jor-El come back? Does the Fortress come back when he reverses time?
Well, yes. I mean, that's the thing. That's why this ending undermines all of the proceedings, right? Because it's a very like I said, closing this loop of the son becoming the father, father becomes the son, everything really comes to, this is really the end of a major chapter in Superman's life. And he destroys the fortress. Its location has been compromised. Jor-El is no longer available to him. So he destroys it. And then theoretically that all gets undone with the reversal of time. So again, another instance of how that doesn't work.
Because it's the worst thing that breaks the movie for me, like I said, but like I could see it as Jor-El exists beyond time and space. So even Superman resetting time would not restore the fortress, because why would he go to the trouble of destroying the fortress? But listen, this movie in this form is not concerned with those kind of questions.
Well, so, anyway. The theory you raise is an interesting one. I could get on board with that, but it's like, what? Why does he do anything? The second he gets his powers back, he should just go reverse time. Why does he even bother with fighting them?
That's the go-to move.
So
there is a very interesting fan edit of this. I've seen many fan edits of this. I actually have a good friend of mine that made a fan edit that combined both versions. And I'll send that to you if you want. But it's the ultimate version of this movie. But he actually has Jor-El and Lara in it as well. So both of them. So anyway, it's very interesting. So I'll send it to you. But don't ask me, everybody. I can't be sending it to everybody. But there's another version I saw years ago that somebody made. What you said made me think of this. Where like they make a 3.5 hour long cut, and what they do is like they have the Metropolis battle, and he flies off. And he reverses Earth, and then they like play out the movie again with the other alternate scenes. That was a very interesting, it's kind of you laugh, but it's kind of a fun experiment, because that's exactly what, why not?
That's actually kind of brilliant. That's
right?
Really kind of brilliant. I know, and I haven't seen it, but I know, or I suspect there's some combined cut of 1 and 2 out there.
Oh, I'm sure there's edits of every variation these days, right?
Because that would be interesting to see, and it's funny, like we talked about the lengthy recap sequence that we get at the beginning of this. And I agree with you that inelegant is a great word, because it doesn't have the flow of a true recap montage. It just really shows you, and not entire scenes in a lot of instances, they do cut them down somewhat, but there's a lot of scenes and it jumps around. It's a little awkward.
It's so long.
And it goes on for quite some time.
I understand, previously on Smallville, you have 30 seconds and you're going to see weird things out of context and kind of get you up to speed. But I'm like, it's almost 10 minutes long, right? And it's like, but why we Lex push him to a thing? And it's very, who's this woman? And if you didn't know anything, this wouldn't help you, I don't think. The recap on Superman 2 was extremely helpful to if you didn't see the first one, these people are Kryptonian villains. The planet blew up and they landed, made their way towards Earth, and it's very efficient. They even show the way that they sync the recap footage, right, from Superman the movie in with the credits is so good, and inspires Spider-Man 2 with the Alex Ross paintings as well. Another Spider-Man 2 reference here. Just strange. So anyway,
yeah, I mean, and this is another instance where maybe they could have allowed themselves a little bit more freedom here, where it's like, okay, we're assembling this Donner cut now in the 2000s, when fans have been watching these movies for years and they have them available on home video and not streaming, I guess, at that point, but digitally. So it's not like it was before, when people need that recap. I mean, I feel like they could have gotten away with just showing that rocket go off, show Superman divert the rocket, show it, free the Phantom Zone criminals, go to our opening credits, or do something like you said, like we saw in Superman 2, the theatrical cut, where you weave the flashbacks into the credits. I think either of those would have been a better option than what we got here.
Well, you mentioned some kind of combined edit, and Ali Salkind, I read an interview, maybe with Superman Cinema back in the day, but apparently in the 90s, he had been wanting to release some kind of combined official version of these, and W was like, no, we've moved past those. We're doing other things, because Superman Lives is coming out, right? Just let's fast forward 10 years in the future and see where we are, right? But and this is the most interesting thing that I've kind of unlocked everything to me. You could really fit these things together. You use Superman flying backwards, time waves come off Earth and break the Phantom Zone, and that is your consequence the time travel. Because even when the nuclear bomb blows up in Superman 2, the theatrical version, like even look kind of like time waves, right? It wouldn't really take that much editing. I'm sure a fan could do. Someone go do this, right? Make a combined version, and that's kind of your consequence of what you did, right? Yeah. Anyway, I thought, because I think perhaps maybe even better than like a combined version of, both versions of 2, maybe some just epic, a 4-hour epic, if you will. DC Comics does that now with movies, but like seriously, like combine 1 and 2, right? And have this as, kind of the, because then you don't have the like, man, there's no Jimmy or Perry in this, or Lois and Clark's relationship. There's not much there, but it's kind of, if it just continues on from the first movie, that might be a better flow. But anyway, these
yeah,
these are all things. All things are possible with these movies. It's just fun to discuss because we live with them our whole lives, and we kind of think of these interesting new ways they can fit together. But I think those are all fascinating ideas.
I like the time wave idea, and I think that solves the problem that a lot of us have had with Superman the movie. This whole warning about interfering with human history, and then we say that there's no consequences. That would be a worthwhile consequence that he then has to deal with. The other thing that really kind of struck me as I was rewatching the Donner cut in particular, in the first movie, you see the forming of the relationship with Lois. He, has this moment where he wants to reveal his secret. He doesn't. Of course, now we see that carry through in this movie where she learns his identity. They embark on a relationship. He makes this choice that then he regrets. In the end, let's put the time reversal aside. He has come to terms with the fact that it's a conceit of the movie that it is what it is, right? He can't have it both ways, right? And so he's made his choice. And that door, sadly, it's very sad, but that door is closed to him, that romance, because he has a higher purpose, a higher calling, a higher happiness, as Jor-El would put it. He no longer has Jor-El. The Kryptonian part of him is gone. The fortress is no more. I really feel like it's a fitting end to the Donnerverse, or at least I know Superman Returns opens that door, but it's a fitting end to those 2 movies. And yeah, it would have been, and this is really what I'm wrestling with, because it's like, yeah, it would have been cool to see Donner do Superman 3. It would have been cool to see Brainiac, which is what he talked about wanting to use Brainiac. Of course it would have been cool. And of course you can always tell new adventures with the character. But I think really thematically, looking at these 2 together, they really do tell a complete story, and you get to the end of it and it's like, I don't know, what would you want to see in the next movie? Him flirting with Lois again? It's like, we know that's not going anywhere. And we've dealt with the Kryptonian business of the criminals who were set up in the first movie. I mean, I think it really works I want to know what you think, but for me, I feel it works very well as an end to at least to those 2 movies.
Well, you obviously have the Marlon Brando connection, but I kind of think about Godfather and Godfather Part 2, right? Like, did you need a Godfather Part 3? It feels kind of disconnected. We kind of said everything we needed to say about these characters in the first 2. And yeah, interestingly enough, Marlon Brando does not appear in Godfather Part 2, and much like Superman 2. But yeah, it's a dilemma that the comics kind of have. I'm not sure when those take place, the Superman 78 comics, which I love, by the way. But I'm like, when are these, after 2 or between 1 and 2, or which version? And anyway.
So we talked about this in the last episode, which you have not heard yet based on when we're recording, but our best guess, they purposely keep it a bit ambiguous. So I don't think you can really pin it down definitively, but our best guess is that it takes place between the first 2 movies.
Yeah. And that 1 week period. Yeah. But anyway, I'm fine with that, right? Superman in vague sequels. That's the name of the game with this character in these versions, and this version of the character, the Donnerverse especially. But yeah, it's Superman 3, they brought in Lana Lang, but so that was, I love Annette O'Toole as Lana Lang. I think it's fantastic, but it was a very kind of different kind of whole approach, obviously, than this. So it'd be strange to just have another adventure at the Daily Planet, business as usual, kind of thing, because we've kind of said what we needed to say with these characters. So maybe it would have been best to kind of just, this right here, volume 1 and volume 2 of Richard Donner's Superman, right? And here they are, and we'll move on from it. And yeah, I mean, when you see movie franchises and stories you love kind of go off the rails, you're often like, man, I wish they just would have stopped. But then you're like, but I want more of the stuff I love. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle. It's like Smallville, 10 years. I'm glad there's 10 years, would have been a better show if there were less and was more condensed. We have an whole episode about that. You guys can go check out.
People really like that episode,
strange.
by the way. I got a lot of really good feedback on that, so I thank you.
Well, there you go. Well, we're going to have to come back and do like what we love about Smallville episode, because we were very hard on Smallville in that episode. But no, I'm glad to hear, because that was a very fun talk to have. But yeah, it's that what if game, right? With all this favorite stuff. Like, of course, like, yeah, you tell me you get another Richard Donner directed Superman movie starring Christopher Reeve, I am there. But then I'm like, what did they do? I don't know. But then sometimes you see movie series, you think, you look at movies like the Rocky franchise, right? It's like, well, they're done. What could they possibly do? And they come out with like Rocky Balboa and Creed. I'm like, these are fantastic movies. These movies have no right to be this good. You found a way. You unlocked what to do to continue the story. So
you're speaking my language, man. You know, I love Rocky. But yeah, well, and that's the thing. And in fairness, I'm going to, just for a second, I'm going to walk back what I said a little bit, because I could see a version where we got a Superman 3 directed by Donner that included Brainiac. And so now you're perhaps reintroducing another aspect of the Kryptonian heritage, depending on which interpretation of Brainiac they would be going with, or at least alien culture, right? So what now has been closed off to him with the fortress gone, now that's being opened up in a little bit of a different way. And look, who knows how it would have progressed with Lois? I mean, again, in my headcanon, I'm omitting the time reversal at the end of the movie. I'm assuming we end the movie with her knowing his secret. But even if she didn't know his secret, like, Superman knows he can't have this relationship, right? But maybe that changes. Maybe something changes and his perspective shifts and he finds a way where he can have this balance. I mean, there are always ways that they could go, but in terms of what we got here, I really do think it is a fitting conclusion. And that was maybe my biggest new takeaway from rewatching the Donner cut, was this idea that I think it really closes a lot of loops. Look, plot-wise, we have the action from the first movie, the Rocket freeing these criminals who were, of course, introduced in the first movie, seeking revenge on his father. I mean, it all ties together in a nice way. You think about Zod, though, and it's like how much you have to hate someone to want to enact revenge on their offspring. I mean, that's pretty... It's pretty intense.
And one day your ass.
Your ass. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, if there's anything to expand on this mythology, right? Of like more comic books or stories, I would love more of a Krypton backstory between Jor-El and Zod. She's like, you've been known to disagree with the council before, right? Like, you could be second only to me in the New Order. Like, they could have been cool, right? And they play into that in other Smallville, right? They play into other versions where like Jor-El and Zod are like friends or at least allies, and like could have seen a separate way, and even Man of Steel, right? Like they were like, hey man, like I'm going to honor the man you were, and that kind of thing. So there's always this connection between those characters, which is maybe even more interesting than perhaps Superman and Zod, Jor-El and Zod, right?
Yeah, totally. The one minor thing though that did make me laugh that struck me as I was watching was when the villains are going through their rampage in the small town, and Ursa laughs at the fact that the humans need machines to fly. And I'm saying to myself, hey lady, you've had powers for like 2 minutes. You come from a planet where people don't have powers. Why is this so like they get drunk on their powers very quickly? I guess that's part of the point, but it just made me laugh. It's like, this shouldn't be so amusing to you.
Yeah. And they're a good trio. They complement each other well, right? Because Zod is like the kind of tactician, like evil force mastermind, and Ursa's like his loyal lieutenant who's like seditious, and then Non is like this mindless but very destructive force, right? And it's these two Donner Superman movies, so you have these trio of villains, right? it's kind of the template. So if they had a Superman 3 with Brainiac, I guess he'd have two sidekicks and or something like that. Who knows? But it's an interesting comparison to draw, right? But between the two, and yeah, I wish Sarah Douglas and Jack O'Halloran would have showed up on Smallville. I mean, everybody else did. So
that would have been cool. If there's anything else that you want to talk about that we didn't get to, we can certainly circle back. But the last maybe big question, tying it back to Smallville, that I wanted to ask you is, in the final moments of the series, we had gotten pieces of the John Williams score at various key moments throughout Smallville, but it was in the final moments of the series finale that we got the full-blown Superman theme. And I guess my main question is that, did you enjoy that? Were you happy that was the the payoff, and because it so calls to mind the Donner movies, did you like that we were building towards that version of Clark becoming Superman, or did you feel that the show should have carved more of its own path?
Yeah, let me bounce off that with another thought about the music. Actually, you mentioned the series finale. I loved that they built to that. There are other great Superman themes, but I almost always come back to like they should use the John Williams theme the same way they use the John Barry theme for James Bond. It's like that's the Superman theme. Hans Zimmer's theme is great for Man of Steel. They don't play it very much in the sequels, though, do they? I don't know why. That being said, like building towards that, I was 100% for that on Smallville. Although I liked the music better in season 2 when it was reorchestrated by Mark Snow to be like, here's the themes we use on the show, and now it's this music instead of like putting the CD in for John Williams and pressing play, right? Which is what they did in the series finale. I had always hoped they would transition the music from the Blur theme to the Superman theme. Smallville fans know what I'm talking about. But in the Donner cut, actually, I wanted to mention this. Like they use all John Williams music from Superman the movie, which is a fantastic score, one of the greatest scores of all time. And in a vacuum, it's unquestionably superior to Ken Thorne's Superman 2 score, right? More scope, more recordings. I don't know. It just sounds better. Okay. It just sounds better. But there is a thing in the Donner cut where they repeat a lot of the same da, 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 da. You hear that theme like 10 times in the movie because they're putting music from another movie onto this movie. And sometimes it works. The Superman theme triumphantly, like totally works. But like John Williams never wrote a true like Phantom Zone theme for the villains. Had he come back for 2, I'm sure he would have expanded on the work he did on Superman the movie. But like these like clicks and hums and tones, like you can only go so far with that, right? To the point where in Superman 3, Ken Thorne is still using those themes for evil Superman. I'm like, can you expand? No, Ken Thorne was you're sure mandated, like, hey, make it sound like that, and you need to find a job. But I guess my point with all that is like you hear like, hey, they're just going to use John Williams music for the Richard Donner. I'm like, oh, it's fantastic. And then you see it, and you're like, you know what? A lot of the Ken Thorne stuff kind of fit what we were seeing more than the John Williams stuff in the Richard Donner cut. So yeah, I love hearing like the John Williams version of these, but it's like again. The ultimate version of this is somewhere in between having to be like, no, I don't want any of that Ken Thorne stuff because that was with the Richard Lester version. I only want the John Williams stuff he wrote for my movie. Like that's where Donner's coming from. I have no doubt. And I understand it, but I think it's not like a deal breaker or anything, but it is noticeable how repetitive some of the themes are to me anyway, in this version of the movie. So.
No, I appreciate the observation. I'll be honest. A lot of that I was ignorant of, like it didn't register with me as I was watching it, but my next viewing, whenever that is, I'll definitely
take a shot every time you hear dun 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 dun. You will pass out. You won't finish the movie. I guarantee you. But to your point about Smallville, I absolutely wish it would. Now, musically, yes, use the John Williams music. Narratively, forge your own path. There's no reason to turn Tom Welling into Christopher Reeve in the last 10 episodes of the show, which you decided to do. We talked a little bit about that in our small episode, but it was like, oh, hey, I'm bumbling. I love the Clark thing of Chris Reeve, but that was his Clark. Like Tom Welling has not been that guy. You worked at the Daily Planet for 3 years without glasses, bro. You can't go back, So, so character wise, don't dovetail into the Reeve movies, but aesthetically, I like the octagonal disc and the Star Blades and things from the early seasons. But it's not like it didn't like really upset me that they embraced the fortress and the crystals and the ice. Cause I don't think we're ever going to get away from that with the Superman and stuff. Man of Steel was kind of a shot in the arm, and I respected that a lot for reinventing Krypton from, scratch as far as live action goes. But the actual aesthetics and stuff, fine, but not the character, So if that answers your question about, Smallville and Superman Donnerverse merging into one.
Yeah, it does. No, for sure. And I think that's, for myself, largely I agree with that. This has been a theme on these episodes, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I love Donner's vision, and I've come to love it even more. I particularly love it in the context of his movies, and taking something like Superman 78, a comic meant to be part of that universe. I am more on board with that than when we have attempts to try to replicate that in a different medium, a different story, because I think that it's, I don't know, a fool's errand to some extent to try to to try to capture that when I feel like a lot of the stuff that I've enjoyed so much, I've enjoyed because of the ways that it is different. Like to your point, that Krypton sequence on Man of Steel is fantastic, and it's a completely different visual aesthetic than we've had before. And, I appreciated that it went in a different direction. So, and on a similar note with Smallville, there's a wonderful, beautiful piece of music that plays during Clark's The Trials sequence in the series finale when Jor-El is showing him all of his saves. And I love that music, and it felt like the show. And I guess maybe I would have liked during that final shirt rip at the end if we had gotten another original piece that was unique to Smallville, that represented that show more specifically. I get the pull, like I get the attraction, and it's certain, that music is so iconic, so distinct, and it so calls to mind what so many people think of with the character. So I understand. I guess I just, I think there's more value in trying to chart something new, not reinvent the wheel, but kind of put your own spin on it. But, again, like I said, I certainly understand why people always go back to that. Is there anything else?
We will forever live in the shadow of these movies, right? I mean, even during Smallville's run, they made Superman Returns, which is like the ultimate, like living in the shadow of these movies. And then Man of Steel breaks away from it. And, some people are hesitant to it and some people aren't. And I mean, Christopher Reeve is my favorite live action Superman. I think he'll be the once and forever Superman. I was thinking about this the other day. Maybe this is too a strange comparison, but it's like, you know what? I think my grandfather was the greatest man who ever lived. But I will never be my grandfather. I can just be myself, right? So Tyler Hoechlin cannot be Christopher Reeve, and he can just be Tyler Hoechlin, right? So maybe that's a strange comparison, but that's I came to that conclusion the other day, sitting here in my office with my Superman 4 poster behind me, watching Superman and Lois on the TV. It's like, you know what? There's room for both these versions. So as much as I love the Christopher Reeve version, and to me, that'll just always be, and it's okay for it to always be my favorite. But it's like to just don't let me say this, don't not like other versions because they're not this, like or dislike them based off their own merits, right? And it's got to be their own thing, and he can be great in his own right, but he's just not going to be Christopher Reeve, and that's fine. For example, anyway, Henry Cavill, go down the list of whoever plays Superman now and moving forward. But to me, seeing this as a kid, this left an indelible impression on me forever. And I think that's a huge thing to do with it too. Nostalgia is a very powerful thing. So, and if Christopher Reeve was still around, I'm sure the DC would be trying to find a way to work him to the Flash movie, right? It's Superman in some capacity, right? So that's the legacy of this Donnerverse, right? I mean, the Superman 78 comic book, you guys talked about it, but it's the Donnerverse version, right? And it's not just like the Christopher Reeve version, it's the Donnerverse version. It's between 1 and 2. They don't pick up after Nuclear Man, right? They take a right in the middle of those movies. So there's just, there's a reason this has a cultural impact, and rightly so. And for all its faults, right? Superman 2, it's like, I still love it, right? Like I've said, I've learned to stop worrying and love Superman 2 again. And I feel better about it. So I'm not just as nitpicky as you probably guys think I hate this movie, but all my nitpicks, I usually feel this way when I last couple of times I go on your podcast talking about these things. But again, this all comes from a place of love. If I didn't obsessively love these movies, I would not have these strong opinions about them. So.
Well said. And, for anyone who listened to our Superman 2 episode last year and felt like, oh man, I don't love it. Again, for as much as we did pick apart here, maybe this one lined up more with your love for the movie. Maybe not. I don't know, but I hope you enjoyed either way. Zach, I thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this event here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, any place, I'm down to talk some Superman with you, man.
Right on. Well, everyone, make sure that you check out the Always Hold On to Smallville podcast, available on all major podcast platforms, especially if you are a Smallville fan. If you've not listened, you really need to. And even if you're not a Smallville fan, you've been covering Superman and Lois as well. So if you've been, fans have been watching that show, you can listen to Always Hold On to Superman and Lois on the same feed. Yes?
Yeah, it is. And again, being inundated through, I think I've just kind of, that same thing I was talking about earlier. I do a podcast about Smallville. I love these Superman, Christopher Reeve movies. I'm watching Superman and Lois. It's so great to have so many different versions of this character, right? And so people are going to respond to some, and I respond to others. And there's plenty of room for all these interpretations. So I feel like right now, because Superman is very, people have really strong opinions about him. I don't know if you noticed. I don't know if you've been on the internet, but it's like, it's okay to like certain versions and not like other versions, and I'm very thankful that there are plenty enough to experience. And Lois and Clark, like whatever, right? For whatever mood you're in, there's a Superman for you. And I still think Batman's a more malleable character, but I so much enjoy exploring these other versions of the character. And I think it just reinforces my fandom of Superman, being able to experience him in all these different formats. So
I hear you, man. And that's definitely been my experience doing this. And it's been a beautiful journey to have as a Superman fan. So again, folks, make sure you check out the Always Hold On to Smallville podcast. Make sure you come back here in 1 week. I will be joined by Tyler from the Krypton Report podcast. And we are going to talk about the 1984 Supergirl movie. So get ready for that. We'll be back next week. Until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. One action I hope you will take is to consider joining my Patreon community. My new spin-off podcast, Digging for Justice, a DC movie fan journey, is coming soon exclusively on my Patreon, starting at the $1 level. Many more rewards are available too, including a robust catalog of bonus podcasts. Thank you to all patrons for enabling me to produce this show.